The woman known to history as Eva Braun, the longtime mistress and briefly the wife of Adolf Hitler, was born in the Bavarian city of Munich, Germany, on the 6th of February 1912. The second of three daughters, her parents christened her Eva Anna Paula Braun. Eva's father, Friedrich Braun, was a high school vocational teacher, and her mother, Franziska Kronberger, was a homemaker who, prior to her marriage, had worked for a textile firm as a seamstress. In 1908, Franziska gave birth to her eldest daughter, Ilse. In 1915, the Brauns welcomed their youngest daughter, Margareta, whom everyone called Gretel. The Brauns had a difficult family life, but Eva maintained fairly close ties with her parents and sisters throughout her adulthood, most particularly her younger sister Gretel. Eva's family faced challenges similar to many of their fellow Germans during the early 20th century, including the upheaval of the First World War and the accompanying economic hardships. Friedrich Braun enlisted voluntarily when war broke out in 1914, serving first in Serbia and then in a hospital in Würzburg until 1919. When he came home, Friedrich and Franziska's marriage promptly fell apart. Eva was just 6 years old when her father came home from the war, and she probably had little or no memory of him prior to his return. Like so many women during wartime, Franziska had coped alone with her three daughters during her husband's absence. The exact reasons for the Brauns' marital discord are unclear, but perhaps the couple's near-complete separation for almost the entirety of the war contributed to the decision to separate permanently. Perhaps Friedrich, like so many men who witnessed the horrors of modern warfare for the first time between 1914 and 1919, had suffered trauma which his marriage could not withstand. One recently published biography of Eva Braun claims that her father struggled with alcoholism, adding another dimension of pain to the picture of the Brauns' family life. Whatever the reasons, Friedrich and Franziska finalized their divorce in 1921. Interestingly, they renewed their marriage only a year later. Some historians believe that her parents reconciled for purely financial reasons. Maintaining just one household during the economically turbulent post-war period in Germany was challenging enough. After a year of trying to maintain two households, Friedrich and Franziska likely decided that they could only afford to support one, and they remarried in 1922. The marital difficulties of the Brauns apparently made their home life extremely tense and fraught. According to Eva's childhood friend, Herta Ostermeier, Eva spent as much time away from home as possible, presumably so she would not have to listen to her father and mother arguing. She apparently spent so much time at the Ostermeyers' house as a child that she even called Herta's parents mother and father. Like many other struggling German families, the Brauns' financial circumstances began to improve markedly by 1925, thanks to the infusions of American money flowing into Germany as a result of the Dawes Plan of 1924. Friedrich, Franziska and their daughters moved into a much nicer apartment and were even able to afford a car. Unfortunately, improvement in the family's material circumstances did not serve to improve the Brauns' marriage, and they evidently remained unhappy together. Notably, all three of their daughters effectively left home as soon as they reached the age of majority. Some of Eva's biographers note that she struggled with depression throughout her adolescence and into her early 20s, perhaps partly owing to her turbulent family life. Eva spent her childhood in Munich attending a local elementary school and later a Catholic lyceum in the city. She was a decent student, but an exceptionally strong athlete who loved any and all sports, which she continued to enjoy throughout her adulthood. In 1928, when she was 16, she left home to attend the Marienhoer Institute, a Catholic vocational school at Simbach am Inn. She spent 1 year at the institute, studying domestic arts and secretarial skills, including bookkeeping and typing. Eva received an education which was quite good for a girl from a lower middle-class German family at the time. An education designed to prepare her for marriage, but one that also gave her practical job training so that she could just as easily support herself. Secretarial skills were highly valuable in the young women's job market, and Eva was able to secure a position quite soon after graduation. In 1929, she responded to a newspaper advertisement for a shop assistant at the photo studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, the unofficial photographer and propaganda photojournalist for the Nazi Party. Eva worked behind the counter at the shop, selling postcards, photographs, and cameras, as well as managing the store accounts and inventory. Over time, Hoffmann also trained Eva in the skills and processes of professional photography, including how to operate all of the equipment and how to develop photographs. The career of a professional photographer was a rare and privileged one for a young woman in 1930s Germany, and Eva continued to work for Hoffmann as a photographer for the propaganda wing of the Nazi Party for the next decade and more. And it was in this niche that she continued to explore and develop her chief interests, including media, the fashion and beauty industries, cinema, and popular culture. It was not long after she first began working at Hoffmann's studio that Eva Braun first met Adolf Hitler. The exact date is unknown, but one of Eva's biographers recounted the following anecdote of their first meeting, although it should be noted that the sources for this historical account are not very well documented. Reportedly, sometime in October of 1929, when closing time was approaching, a tall, middle-aged man with a short, thin mustache walked into Heinrich Hoffmann's shop. Hoffmann introduced the visitor to Eva as Herr Wolf and asked her to run out and fetch some beer and sausages. Then all three sat down to eat while Hoffmann chatted companionably with the so-called Herr Wolf, who, throughout the meal, seemed unable to stop staring at Eva. When he rose to leave, he offered her a ride home in his Mercedes, which she politely declined. "Haven't you guessed who that gentleman is?" Eva's boss asked her as soon as their guest had departed. "No," she replied. "Don't you ever look at our photos?" Hoffmann asked incredulously. "It's Hitler, Adolf Hitler." Being a native of Munich, Eva of course knew all about the aggressively populist leader of the NSDAP, whose political power and reputation had only grown throughout the previous decade. Heinrich Hoffmann was not only Hitler's personal propaganda photojournalist, but a close family friend who remained part of the dictator's intimate inner circle to the end. Because so few personal letters or writings survive from either Adolf Hitler or Eva Braun that might shed light on the details of their relationship, her biographers have relied heavily on the post-war testimony and memoirs of those who survived the war, including Hoffmann's memoirs. According to Hoffmann, Hitler did not seem very interested in Eva initially, though Hoffmann claimed that Eva's regard for Hitler was obvious. One biographer speculated that the 17-year-old Eva, whose home life had long been difficult and unhappy, was attracted to the projected authority of a father figure, which Hitler may have represented for her. Perhaps it was his regional celebrity that impressed her. As inconceivable as it seems to most observers today, Eva may even have found him handsome, as indeed many women in 1930s Germany did. But Hitler may have been more interested in Eva than he was willing to admit to Hoffmann. Despite his chief photographer's later claims about Hitler's initial lack of interest in Eva, he was apparently interested enough to order a discreet investigation into Eva's background. As early as 1930, only months after meeting her, Hitler had privately asked his secretary, Martin Bormann, to investigate whether Eva's ancestry was fully Aryan, which it apparently was. Believing that a large part of his popularity stemmed from his decision to remain a bachelor, Hitler probably kept his feelings hidden, if he had any, for Hoffmann's young employee. Hoffmann's daughter, Henrietta, remembered Eva remarking that every time Hitler came into the studio after their first meeting, he seemed to have time for a chat with her. He sometimes brought her small gifts or offered to drive her home. Yet 2 more years would pass before the relationship became more serious. At the time of Hitler's first meeting with Eva Braun, he was living with his 21-year-old niece, Geli Raubal, the daughter of his half-sister Angela. The nature of this relationship is still unclear, and some historians have characterized its dynamics as sexually codependent, if not overtly intimate. But whatever else it was, the relationship was certainly highly controlling and restrictive for Geli. She had moved in with her uncle at the age of 17 to attend school in Munich and continued to live with Hitler for several more years after failing to complete her studies. she had a brief love affair with Hitler's chauffeur Emil Maris in 1927. Enraged, Hitler had fired Emil and dramatically restricted his niece's activities and freedoms. He kept her home, away from friends and visitors, and assigned a guard to accompany her anywhere she went. In the fall of 1931, when Hitler was away in Nuremberg, Geli Raubal is believed to have committed suicide by shooting herself in the chest with Hitler's own Walther pistol. It was rumored that the two had quarreled over a young man from Linz in her native Austria that Geli wanted to marry. Hitler had apparently forbidden the marriage, leaving his Munich apartment in a rage. Geli's death was a major scandal for Hitler, and his political opponents did not waste the opportunity to suggest that an incestuous and abusive relationship had driven Hitler's niece to her death. It was even suggested he might have arranged her murder himself. Most historians, however, tend to reject this last suspicion. According to most accounts, Hitler was devastated by Geli's death. He reportedly kept her room in his apartment just how she had left it, and kept portraits of her in all of his private residences until his own death. However, the observer should not ignore the reality that this highly publicized personal tragedy did much to win Hitler greater sympathy with his political supporters and help facilitate his rise to national power during the following year. Within weeks of his niece's passing, Hitler began to spend a good deal more time with Eva Braun. Because Eva worked for Hoffmann, Hitler's close friend, it was made easier for him to carry on an extremely discreet relationship with her. He took her out occasionally for a meal or a movie or to the opera, but more frequently, Eva's employment with Hoffmann made it possible for she and Hitler to meet more privately, either at the shop after hours or in Hoffmann's own home. According to multiple sources, including Hitler's housekeeper, by 1932, Eva was spending nights at his apartment whenever he was in Munich. Hitler was adamant that he should never marry or carry on a romantic relationship in the public eye. His public persona, carefully crafted over many years, was one of austerity and patriotic sacrifice. Hitler believed that German women supported him politically because they admired his supposed commitment to his people above all else. Additionally, a casual relationship with a young girl half his age was completely antithetical to the official Nazi ideology, which was both highly traditional and family-oriented. He was, therefore, resolved to keep his relationship with Eva Braun both informal and secret, believing that if he married, his female supporters would find him less attractive, and the German people would cease to view him as a lonely and lofty figure dedicated only to Germany. But Eva was evidently not satisfied with being Hitler's part-time secret girlfriend. She saw less and less of him during the summer and fall of 1932, when he was deeply engaged in campaigns for the chancellorship and the Nazi Party's election to a majority in the Reichstag. Some historians believe that Eva's disappointment at Hitler's continued absence and her dejection over what she perceived as his lukewarm regard for her led her to attempt suicide sometime during the autumn of 1932. While sources differ on the exact date and some of the minor details of this event, several witnesses and biographers believe that Eva's suicide attempt was a desperate cry for attention from Hitler. Eva shot herself in the chest with her father's pistol and then quickly contacted a certain Dr. Plater for emergency medical attention. Plater was Heinrich Hoffmann's doctor, and some scholars believe that Eva's decision to contact him first was strategic. According to this reasoning, Eva could just as easily have contacted Dr. Martin Marx for help, for whom her sister Ilse worked as a medical secretary. But Eva instead summoned a doctor, perhaps via Hoffmann himself, who would be guaranteed to promptly inform Hitler of what had happened. By the next day, Hitler had returned to Munich and was at Eva's bedside. Upon hearing from the doctor that she had purposely aimed for her heart, Hitler reportedly remarked to Hoffmann that he had not realized how much Eva loved him. Perhaps thinking of his niece Geli, Hitler said that he was now resolved to take care of the poor child. Indeed, despite his assumption of national power in 1932, Hitler often spent less time in Berlin at the Reichschancellery in the ensuing years than he did in Munich or at the Berghof, his vacation retreat near Berchtesgaden on the Obersalzberg. Whenever he returned to Bavaria from Berlin, whether to Munich or to the Berghof, Eva joined him. She still continued to work at Heinrich Hoffmann's photo studio, but also became an unofficial party photographer herself, selling her photographs of Hitler and other party members to Hoffmann, who paid her extremely well for them, presumably at Hitler's request. Being known as Hoffmann's junior photographer helped Eva to remain close to Hitler in the most discreet fashion possible. Eva was now 21 years old and officially an adult, but she still technically lived with her parents, as most young unmarried German women tended to do. Throughout the years of Eva's relationship with Hitler, it seems to have been Heinrich Hoffmann who provided a wall of respectability around Eva. If she stayed out late, spent the night out, or left suddenly to spend a few days on the Obersalzberg, it may have been Hoffmann's province to reassure any concerned parties that Eva was merely working, accompanying party members as a photographer or secretary. In fact, she frequently did fulfill such roles during her travels with Hitler, especially in the early years of their relationship. Despite the significant amounts of time they spent together, they managed to keep their affair an almost total secret as far as the general public was concerned. They were publicly photographed together only once over more than a decade, at the Olympic Winter Games in February of 1936. In the photo, the two are not even sitting together, and Eva Braun can be seen seated in the row behind Hitler. Indeed, it seems only their family members and closest friends knew about Hitler's girlfriend. When rumors of Eva Braun's relationship with the Führer became known to the German public at the end of World War II, many did not believe them at first, so solid was the wall of silence which had been erected around her. According to multiple contemporary witnesses, even when they were surrounded by friends and family at the Berghof estate, relaxed and well out of the public eye, Hitler and Braun always scrupulously avoided even the slightest displays of affection toward one another. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, armaments minister, and member of the dictator's intimate inner circle, noted in his memoirs that Eva Braun had her own suite of rooms in each of Hitler's residences, including at the Berghof. Yet, he claimed, at the end of the evening's activities, Hitler and Braun would quietly withdraw to Hitler's rooms. The question of a sexual relationship between Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun has long been a matter of speculative curiosity for historians. Most scholars agree that there was an undeniable closeness and intimacy between Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, but the exact nature of this intimacy will likely never be known for sure. In light of the unparalleled horrors perpetrated by the Nazi regime, it is very difficult for most historical observers to imagine or explore the human facets of his or Eva Braun's lives. Although we understand that such aspects of life are important biographical details, it can be for many people extremely unsettling to confront the humanity in individuals who, because of their deeds and convictions, we can only see as monstrous and repugnant. Biographers and historians have speculated widely. Some imagine that the twisted and hate-filled Hitler must have had some unthinkable sexual proclivities, while others believe instead that he and Eva had a fairly conventional, albeit extremely discreet sexual relationship. One of Eva Braun's most recent biographers, however, claims to have uncovered previously unknown testimony and documentary evidence that the sexual relationship between herself and Hitler was mostly non-existent. According to this chain of evidence, Eva Braun was born with a reproductive condition called Mayer-Rokitansky syndrome, or MRKH, a rare condition which only occurs in approximately 1 out of every 5,000 women. If this is correct, it is quite possible that Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had no sexual relationship, because many women who live with MRKH find sex extremely painful, depending on the particularities of their individual condition. Eva Braun is not alone as the subject of such deeply personal historical speculation. Numerous scholars have also claimed that Adolf Hitler was also born with one or more congenital reproductive conditions. Some historians believe that he had both an undescended testicle and a condition known as hypospadias, in which the urethra appears on the underside of the genitals rather than the tip. It is generally known that Hitler was utterly paranoid about being seen naked, and even refused to allow his private doctors to examine him unclothed. He disliked being touched unless he instigated it, and both he and Eva Braun shared an intense cleanliness fetish. Hitler pursued so few romantic relationships in his life, none of which can be fully confirmed. So it does seem possible that extreme self-consciousness about his body might have played a part in his determination to remain single. If it was indeed the case that Hitler and Braun had a virtually sexless relationship, it makes the seemingly long-standing bond between them even more interesting. Some might look upon the relationship as a mutual refuge from the sexual expectations that other potential partners might have had. Other scholars suggest that Hitler used Eva, her devotion, and her obvious love for him to project the appearance of an active and socially conventional sex life to members of his inner circle. We can speculate, but the full truth of the matter may never be known. As well as the potential physical health issues she may have suffered, Eva Braun also experienced mental health problems, including depression and suicidal ideation. Indeed, Eva attempted suicide a second time in 1935 by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Historians and biographers have pointed to Hitler's non-committal treatment of Eva during the early years of their relationship to help explain why she might have made the second attempt. A fragmentary document purporting to be Eva Braun's diary, which she supposedly kept during the spring and summer of 1935, reveals that she saw very little of Hitler during these months, and that his lack of commitment to her seemed manifest. It is unclear whether this diary is indeed genuine, for scholars disagree about its authenticity. Eva's older sister, Ilse, examined the document many years later, and apparently believed the handwriting to be that of her sister's, but a few historians are still unconvinced. Hitler's distant manner with his girlfriend was remarked upon by others as well. In his memoirs, Albert Speer noted Hitler's treatment of Eva Braun during the early years of their relationship with distaste. Instead of extending to her the same refined Viennese manners he seemed to show toward other women of his acquaintance, he seemed dismissive and even disrespectful towards Eva. Speer observed that on one occasion Hitler did not even kiss her goodbye or take her hand. When she was departing the Berghof, he simply handed her an envelope which presumably was filled with money. After her second suicide attempt, which many historians tend to view as another bid for Hitler's attention, Eva seemed to advance even further in Hitler's favor. According to her alleged diary, Eva was relieved that she would soon no longer have to play the part of a shop girl for Hitler was going to buy her a house in Munich. In 1935, at the age of 23, Eva officially moved out of her parents' house, and her sister, Gretel, moved in with her. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, it is clear that Eva Braun did come to play a central role in Hitler's life. Despite the fact that she was kept out of sight during most formal or diplomatic functions, she was soon established as the undisputed mistress of the house, even if only to people in the know. Much of the information about their relationship comes from letters, post-war testimony, and memoirs from Eva Braun's family and friends, as well as from Hitler's inner circle of military adjutants, secretaries, private doctors, and high-ranking Nazi officials. These individuals were those received most often by Hitler at the Reichschancellery in Berlin, and were also frequently invited to the more relaxed atmosphere of his Berghof estate. This so-called royal court around Hitler included Joseph and Magda Goebbels, Albert and Margarete Speer, Martin and Gerda Bormann, Heinrich and Erna Hoffmann, and their daughter Henrietta with her husband Baldur von Schirach. The combined documents and testimony from the members of Hitler's royal court reveal a highly narcissistic and insecure man at the very center of it all, a man who dominated every conversation with self-important rambling monologues, and one who could not bear to be challenged or contradicted on anything. Yet several of these witnesses report that by 1935, Eva Braun's position in Hitler's good graces appeared nearly unassailable. She was the only member of his inner circle who dared to remonstrate with him regularly about anything. She had begun, by all accounts, as a quiet, modest, and unassuming presence among Hitler's milieu in Munich and at the Berghof. But over time, she apparently gained confidence as her influence with Hitler grew. This should not suggest that she inserted herself into political or military discussions or attempted to advise or intervene in such matters. Virtually no account describes her doing such a thing, and multiple witnesses claim that she, in fact, had little interest in politics. She did seem, however, to be the only person in Hitler's life who could get away with interrupting him. She rolled her eyes at him when his long rants and diatribes bored her, or seized the initiative to direct the amusement of everyone assembled whenever she found the current activities tiresome. No other members of the royal court could have or would have dared to behave in such a way in Hitler's presence. In the early stages of World War II, when certain goods were being rationed or banned across Germany, Hitler instructed that a ban be placed on makeup and other beauty products. Eva Braun was apparently outraged and remonstrated with Hitler indignantly, after which the dictator amended his original ban to a simple halt on domestic manufacturing. Hitler refused to allow even his own sister Angela, Gailey's mother, to criticize his girlfriend. Angela, who had made no secret about her marked dislike for Eva Braun, distanced herself from her brother soon after Eva became a permanent fixture and de facto mistress of the house at the Berghof. She remained the only regular resident guest able to invite whomever she pleased to the estate, and the guests present usually included a number of her friends or family members, such as her sister Gretel Braun or her childhood friend Hertha Ostermeier and Hertha's husband and children. It is very likely that Eva's privileged position made some of the other members of Hitler's royal court dislike her as well. Various observers who survived the Second World War and the collapse of Nazi Germany described her in ways which varied widely. A few described her as lively and charming, a glamorous and gracious hostess, and utterly devoted to Hitler. Quite a few others described her more negatively, using adjectives like feather-brained, spoiled, and selfish. Albert Speer once observed that she seemed to be devoted only to pleasure, and remarked disdainfully that all members of Hitler's entourage were even required to kindly put up with her two awful little Scottish terrier dogs, Negus and Stasi. Another interesting adjective frequently used by members of Hitler's royal court to describe Eva is apolitical, and the use of this particular description, according to one biographer, is very telling. After all, what is the one burning question that students of history are likely most curious about when it comes to Eva Braun? The question is, did she know? Some historians have been quick to point out that neither Eva Braun nor any members of her family ever actually joined the Nazi Party. However, other scholars believe that it was Hitler's idea to make sure Eva Braun never joined the party. Members of his family, including his sister Angela, never joined the party either. It is possible that Eva never became a member because Hitler wanted to ensure her protection and anonymity as much as possible. Eva's father was the only member of her family to officially join the Nazi Party, and not until as late as 1938. However, one should hesitate to interpret these facts as a sign of reluctance to support Nazism, for there is some evidence to suggest that most members of the Braun family were content to see the Nazi Party's rise to power, as well as content to see Eva enjoy a close relationship with Hitler. Historians generally believe that Heinrich Hoffmann was chiefly involved in providing cover for the relationship between Braun and Hitler, but it is possible that such cover was not needed in the case of the Braun family. Considering the many nights and the more extended periods of time that Eva spent away from home between 1931 and 1935, it somewhat strains credulity to imagine that they did not know or suspect what was going on. Eva Braun did not move into her own residence until 1935, a residence that was purchased by Hoffmann but paid for by Hitler. Eva had worked for Heinrich Hoffmann, a self-advertised supporter of the Nazis, since she was 17, and less than 3 years after she commenced her employment, her younger sister Gretel Braun came to work in Hoffmann's photo house as well. Gretel Braun spent so much time with Eva in Hitler's inner circle, in fact, that she eventually married Hermann Fegelein, SS General and Himmler's liaison to the Führer in 1944. When they were interviewed by one of Eva's biographers, Nerin Gün, During the 1960s, the Braun family seemed not only to have downplayed their difficult family life, but her parents also claimed not to have known anything about the relationship between their daughter and the Nazi leader until many years later. They claimed only to have met him once, by chance, when they saw Hitler and Eva together in a Munich cafe. In light of the facts, however, these claims are rather unconvincing. Two of their daughters spent several years working for a prominent Nazi photographer. They spent years as part of Adolf Hitler's intimate social circle, and much of this took place in Munich, right under their noses. The claims of distance between Eva's family and the Nazi regime are weakened further by the knowledge that as the city of Munich faced bombings and destruction toward the end of the war, Eva's parents and siblings were quick to flee to Hitler's Berghof estate for safety. One member of the Braun family, however, gives the distinct impression of an earnest attempt to distance herself from both the Nazi Party and Eva's relationship with Hitler. Eva's elder sister, Ilse Braun. Ilse was the first to leave home at age 21. The same year that Eva went to work for Heinrich Hoffmann, Ilse went to work as a medical secretary for Dr. Martin Marx. Not only was she employed by Dr. Marx, but she lived with him for 8 years, from 1929 to 1937. It is unclear whether Ilse was simply given room and board in her employer's house, or if the two actually lived together in the romantic sense. But whatever the case, Ilse Braun flatly refused to quit her job despite her sister Eva's attempts to persuade her. Presumably, Eva's issue with Dr. Marx was that he was Jewish. While Eva and Gretel were becoming entrenched in Nazi social circles, their elder sister was quietly living and working with a Jewish doctor. Such a thing, in fact, became illegal following the establishment of the Nuremberg laws in 1935. No person of Aryan ancestry would be permitted to enter into any personal or professional relationship with a person of Jewish ancestry. Yet Ilse continued to work for Dr. Marx for a further 2 years, only leaving her job when it became clear that Dr. Marx was going to lose his license to practice medicine in Germany, as all German Jewish doctors eventually did. Dr. Marx emigrated to the United States in 1938. It was most likely Eva Braun's influence with Hitler that helped Ilse secure her next job, secretary to Albert Speer. Ilse, however, stayed in this position only 6 months. She went on to become a journalist. Unlike her younger sisters, her professional and personal life showed little inclination toward Nazism, which was something that her work colleagues noted about her as well. All this being said, it is highly likely that everyone involved with the Nazi regime, including Eva's family, knew more than they cared to admit later on, when the war was over. So the question still remains, did Eva Braun know about the Holocaust? 8 decades later, that question still remains definitively unanswered. To Westerners, Adolf Hitler is undeniably the most ubiquitously well-known, condemned and reviled figure of the 20th century. The dehumanization and genocide of millions of European Jews and other groups targeted by the Nazis are arguably among the most heinous crimes and greatest tragedies in world history. As one of the individuals closest to Adolf Hitler, naturally we wonder just how far her knowledge of the depravity of Hitler's regime extended. But importantly, how can we ignore the fact that the testimonies about Eva Braun come from some of the most prominent members of the Nazi regime? One must concede that after the war was over and the Allies had emerged victorious, these individuals had every reason to give testimony and write memoirs that downplayed their adherence to a hateful and racist ideology, as well as downplayed the extent of their participation in a sadistic and brutal regime, the painful legacy of which is still deeply felt today. Most members of Hitler's inner circle who survived the war insisted that Eva Braun was apolitical. Indeed, they insisted that Hitler, his adjutants and fellow party officials never even discussed policy or military matters in front of the women. This claim, notes one biographer, appears patently self-serving. If one can create the image of a don't ask, don't tell atmosphere within Hitler's inner circle, then the claim that they did not know the full extent of the regime's crimes until after the war becomes more believable. Although Hitler's hideous final solution was, admittedly, known to relatively few people during the war, some historians now reject the notion that those closest to Hitler, including Eva Braun, could have been kept fully in the dark about what was happening in the forced labor and death camps. Eva Braun and the rest of Hitler's inner circle were certainly well informed about Hitler's determination to eradicate all European Jews. Anti-Semitism was a concept which was fundamental to the party line of the NSDAP. Hitler outlined his poisonous rhetoric very clearly in Mein Kampf and reiterated precisely the same ideas in his last will and testament just hours before his suicide. All of these individuals were present for the 1935 convention in Nuremberg. They saw even more restrictive laws passed against German Jews who had already been removed from civil service and public service jobs, had been subjected to a state-sponsored economic boycott, and to open persecution and violence in the streets. None of them raised their voices in protest when the civil rights of German Jews were revoked, when they were reduced to segregated communities, or subjected to inhumane treatment and conditions. And far from the image of a don't ask, don't tell atmosphere, some historians now suggest that the blurred lines between Hitler's public and private lives made such compartmentalization highly unlikely. The fact is, they insist, Hitler did not compartmentalize his public and private lives at all. Many of those he worked most closely with as Führer were also his close friends and their female counterparts, far from being sheltered from the realities of Hitler's regime, were in fact just as deeply committed to National Socialism and its rabidly anti-Semitic elements as Hitler and his high officials were. Magda Goebbels, Ilse Hess, Emmy Goering, these women were official card-carrying members of the Nazi Party since the early 1920s. Magda Goebbels, in fact, was such an influential public voice among female members of the Nazi Party that for many years she was viewed as the de facto First Lady of National Socialism since Hitler remained unmarried. Why would the husbands of these women, or Hitler himself, bother to work so hard to keep them ignorant of developments which they seemed always to have supported? Hitler's habit of governing events from afar, of issuing policy and military orders in the same environment in which he entertained his friends, most of whom were also his colleagues, brings the claims of his collaborators' lack of knowledge into serious question. We are left with the terrible and chilling notion that those closest to Hitler, including Eva Braun, may well have known the full extent of the crimes of the Nazi regime and found it possible to turn their faces coldly away from the inhumanity which they had helped to nourish. For indeed, their support for Hitler's authority may have been the overriding reason for their privileged positions in his intimate inner circle. Hitler was notoriously insecure and sensitive to criticism, and those closest to him tended to remain in his good graces if they never challenged or contradicted him. Heinrich Hoffmann's daughter Henriette von Schirach recounted an anecdote of just such an occasion in her memoirs. Reportedly, she and her husband Baldur, who had been named Reichsstatthalter and Gauleiter of Vienna, had remonstrated openly with Hitler while in company at the Berghof during the summer of 1943. Baldur had insisted that Hitler must end the war, which was going very badly for Germany, thanks to the heavy bombing of German cities by Allied planes. Henrietta also claimed to have further challenged Hitler by condemning the deportation of Jewish women in Holland, which she witnessed. Enraged, Hitler had apparently screamed back, "You are being sentimental. What do you care about Jewish women in Holland?" Despite the fact that she was the daughter of one of Hitler's closest and oldest friends, Henriette von Schirach and her husband were apparently never invited to the Berghof again following this confrontation. Again, many of these anecdotes must be treated with skepticism and with an eye to the motivations of their writers. Some historians have observed that Henrietta's memoirs, as well as the writings of Hoffmann, Goebbels and Speer, often show attempts at personal exoneration for participation in the crimes of the Nazi regime. But in addition, and more importantly, they reveal that Hitler valued sycophants above all others, What historians have referred to as the cult of the Führer strongly influenced Hitler's image for all of his supporters. Power and favors were given to those who demonstrated the kind of blind faith and absolute loyalty that he seemed to value above all other qualities. And if there is one thing about which all of these witnesses could later agree, it was that Eva Braun's commitment to Hitler to live only for him seemed complete and undeniable. Perhaps this was the reason why she seemed to hold the most privileged place in his life. Throughout the years of World War II, even as Hitler spent more extended time than ever away from Bavaria, and everywhere the privations and brutality of war became steadily more apparent, Eva Braun continued to live an absurdly privileged and luxurious lifestyle in Munich and at the Berghof. She continued to go on pleasure trips with her family and friends, skiing in the mountains or sunning herself in an Italian villa. In a period of rationing and bans on goods, she had access to a seemingly bottomless supply of champagne and fine food, to expensive designer clothing and jewelry, and tailor-made cigarettes. When lively discussions at the Berghof turned uneasy with references to ruined German cities and the Soviets advancing inexorably from the east, Eva would be the first to brightly suggest an outdoor picnic and a swim at nearby Lake Koenigsee, or a fun, if mildly undignified, parlor game. Ironically, Eva Braun, the unofficial First Lady of Nazi socialism, was the very antithesis of the party's official conception of the ideal woman. Far from being the plain, traditional, thrifty matron of virtuous domesticity, Eva Braun was fashionable and cosmopolitan. She was not at all domestic. She wore makeup and bleached her hair. But one biographer has suggested that it was precisely this kind of behavior that may have motivated Hitler to continue projecting confidence in a future victory. Goebbels, who was perhaps just as blindly loyal to Hitler, wrote admiringly of Eva Braun's determination to live as if nothing would change, and praised what he viewed as her efforts to keep Hitler's spirits high. As little as Eva Braun conformed to the National Socialist ideas of womanhood, a further ironic and interesting point is that neither did Hitler adhere to the image of virtue he had cultivated for himself as the Führer, or live by the virtues he extolled to the German people. He saw himself as bohemian and intellectual, appreciating art, architecture, music, theatre, opera, and philosophy. Yet his regime persecuted artists and muzzled intellectuals who refused to conform to party lines. He sometimes seemed as committed to pleasure as Eva was, and officials like Himmler bemoaned the difficulty involved in getting him to respond to communications or make prompt decisions. Hitler's habit of governing from afar, whenever he felt like it, seems striking coming from a person who demanded hard work, conscientiousness, and sacrifice from the German people. Additionally, Hitler's ideology strongly stressed the virtues of marriage and many children, both of which he assiduously avoided while keeping his socially unconventional girlfriend a secret. What we are left with is a vision of hypocrisy, of power, decadence, and privilege purchased at the cost of unthinkable crimes. But there is reason to believe that Eva Braun herself wanted both marriage and children. Very few of her writings survive, but examination of the many surviving photos and home movies she recorded give the observer an impression of deep and wistful yearning. Eva often filmed and photographed Hitler with children, usually the children of visiting guests. It is true that she sold many of these pictures to Heinrich Hoffmann as they were useful in projecting a nurturing and fatherly image of the Führer in Nazi propaganda. But it is also known that Eva preserved many of these images for herself in a personal album. These photographs and home movies hint at Eva Braun's sadness that she and Hitler, for whatever reason, could not marry or have a family. 1943 saw Hitler's longest absence from Bavaria yet. During the campaign on the Eastern Front, Hitler spent most of his time at his command center in Poland, monitoring the invasion of Russia. Yet Eva Braun was still enjoying the good life in Bavaria. She even went on her annual vacation trip to Italy that year. While he was away in Poland, Hitler reportedly telephoned Eva every night around 10 o'clock. By the summer of 1944, the chances of victory for Germany had begun to seem increasingly remote. Henrietta von Schirach recalled advising Eva that when Germany's defeat finally came, she should go into hiding. Eva had apparently responded, "Do you think I would let him die alone? I will stay with him until the last moment. No one can stop me." Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had both made their wills and planned a double suicide as early as 1944 should Germany's defeat prove inevitable. These plans were made following the attempted assassination of Hitler on the 20th of July. He had provided financial support for Eva in his previous will, but his last will and testament referred directly to Eva's enduring loyalty and friendship. It was for these reasons, he claimed, that he had finally decided to marry her before they ended their lives together. Indeed, when Hitler retreated into the Führer bunker beneath the garden of the Reichschancellery, Eva Braun resolutely joined him there, traveling from Bavaria to Berlin, even though the Russians would overrun the city within days. Eva Braun spent the last few days of her life underground with Hitler and a select few members of his inner circle. Mentally, Hitler himself continued to unravel as the end approached. He alternated between bouts of rage at all of the traitors who were now turning their backs on him and desperate delusions that he might possibly find the means to launch one last grand counterattack that might forestall defeat. Eva, however, behaved much as she had always done. She dressed and groomed herself to please Hitler and tried to raise his spirits however she could. When the mood of the company in the bunker grew morose, she handed out champagne, put some music on the record player, and suggested that those assembled should dance and enjoy themselves. In the early morning hours of the 29th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married in the bunker with Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann as witnesses. The short wedding was followed by a brief champagne breakfast with those still remaining in the bunker. The following day, on the afternoon of the 30th of April, Hitler and Braun said goodbye to their companions and retired to the privacy of Hitler's study. Some witnesses reported hearing a gunshot from within. When they entered the study, they found Eva Braun slumped over a sofa. She had bitten into a cyanide capsule. Hitler had tested the poison for efficacy just 2 days before on his own pet dog Blondie. Hitler had bitten into a cyanide capsule as well, and then shot himself in the head with his own pistol. According to Hitler's wishes, their bodies were taken out of the bunker into the garden behind the Reichschancellery, doused in gasoline, and burned. The Soviets were able to identify their bodies using dental records, and the remains of both Hitler and Braun were buried near Magdeburg. Some decades later, their remains are believed to have been re-exhumed by the Russians, cremated once more, and the ashes scattered in the Elbe River. Biographies of Eva Braun are scarce compared to the numerous volumes that have been written about Adolf Hitler, who remains one of the most infamous figures in world history. In fact, Eva Braun continues to be a rather shadowy historical figure, which is surprising considering the degree of her closeness to Hitler himself. Perhaps it was because he took such pains to cloak the relationship in silence. Additionally, all of Hitler's and Braun's documents were destroyed, according to their wishes, after their deaths, with a few exceptions. Before saying goodbye to her sister Gretel, Eva had given her collection of photographs, home movies, and apparently a collection of letters that she and Hitler had written to one another over the years. Heavily pregnant and trying to get to safety after her husband, SS General Hermann Fegelein, was executed for desertion, Gretel entrusted the cache of documents to a man who appeared to be a fellow German refugee, but who was, in fact, an American agent. Eva Braun's photographs and home movies now reside in the American National Archives in Washington, D.C. However, when the collection was received, no letters were found among the documents. This chain of events is both disappointing and very interesting to historians. The fact that Eva Braun was willing to allow these documents to remain intact, seemingly in defiance of Hitler's wishes, might indicate that she wished their contents to become known. Because the rumored letters were never found, we cannot imagine what it was she may have wanted others to know. But perhaps it was that she ultimately demonstrated with her life and the manner of her death that she loved Hitler and that her loyalty to him was complete. Perhaps she wanted to make sure the world knew that he had cared for her too, that she had been important to him after so many years living in anonymity. Some scholars can find it in their hearts to pity her, a young, impressionable girl who wasted herself, her life, and her love as the anonymous companion of a monster. Others are not so willing to empathize and can only revile her as the worst sort of collaborator, a blindly faithful sycophant who probably understood fully the unthinkable price of the luxury and privilege in which she lived. Despite the completion of multiple biographies about her, few of them have added significantly about what was already known about Eva Braun. She remains stubbornly and fundamentally unknowable, since few other sources besides her photographs and homemade films remain. These offer us a silent and haunting window into her world, a world of glamour and privilege that stands in sickening contrast to the brutality perpetrated by those closest to her and, at the very least, tolerated by her. The smiling faces of those in the foreground of her pictures seems to be set against an invisible backdrop in which the silhouettes of countless murdered millions stand mute, waiting expectantly for justice. What do you think of Eva Braun? Was she an innocent young girl with little interest in politics, or someone who knowingly benefited from the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime? Please let us know in the comment section. And as always, thank you very much for watching. The woman known to history as Magda Goebbels was born on the 11th of November 1901 in the capital of the German Empire, Berlin. Her father was Oskar Ritschl, a prominent building contractor and engineer, and Magda's mother was Augusta Behrendt. Magda's parents were not married when she was born, and although they subsequently did marry each other, the union did not last long, and they divorced before Magda was 4 years old. Consequently, she did not have any siblings growing up, and, as we will see, her younger years were considerably disrupted by her parents' divorce at a time when marital separation was still relatively uncommon. Following her parents' divorce in 1905, Magda was quickly packed off in 1906 to Cologne, the city at the heart of Germany's industrial region in the Rhineland in the west of the country. Her father had relocated there for work, and her mother seems to have been unable to support Magda and sent their only daughter to live with him there. However, this arrangement too only lasted a brief time, for in 1908 Augusta Behrendt married Richard Friedlander, a member of a family of wealthy Jewish merchants who lived in Berlin and who specialized in leather goods. Richard's family had extensive business connections throughout Western and Central Europe, and he had lived primarily in Brussels since the late 1890s. Thus, when he and Magda's mother married in 1908, they relocated to the Belgian capital. Augusta quickly requested that Magda be sent to live with her, a petition which her father assented to. Additionally, Richard Friedlander soon adopted Magda, and she took his name. Thus, the woman who would later become known as the First Lady of the Third Reich grew up with a Jewish surname. However, she was educated at the Ursuline convent at Vilvoorde near Brussels, thus ensuring that she was raised primarily as a Roman Catholic, while some have suggested that later contact with her biological father in Western Germany may have led her to inculcating some Buddhist thought, a peculiarity at a time when Asian religious and philosophical systems were considered a subject of exclusively academic inquiry in Europe, rather than anything one might adopt elements of in their own lives. Magda's youth was once again interrupted in 1914. After years of growing tensions between the great powers of Europe, war erupted in the late summer that year after a regional political crisis in the Balkans escalated into a pan-European war. It soon reached even further afield and would become known as the First World War. In Europe, it pitted Magda's native Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire against Britain, France and Russia initially,
though the latter would soon be joined by Italy and the United States, tipping the balance against the Central Powers as the alliance led by the governments in Berlin and Vienna became known. Because of their German ethnicity, Magda, her mother, and her adopted father were forced to leave Brussels following the outbreak of the war. Belgium had been invaded by Germany just days after the conflict erupted, as a way of striking against France without having to go through the extensive French defences in eastern France. As a result, the Friedlanders returned to Berlin, though the marriage did not survive the chaos caused by this latest shift in their affairs. By the end of 1914, Augusta and Richard had divorced, and Magda was once again raised for a time by a single mother. Back in Berlin during the war, Magda became friends with Lisa Arlosarov, a member of a family of Ukrainian Jews who had migrated to Germany in 1905 following an anti-Semitic pogrom against the Jewish community in their part of what was then the Russian Empire. They eventually settled in Berlin and were ordered to stay there or face deportation as Russian-born citizens when the First World War erupted. Through Lisa, Magda would soon meet her brother Chaim, a passionate socialist and Zionist who was increasingly in favor of the idea of the Jewish people returning to the Levant and establishing a new Jewish state in Palestine. As the war was drawing to a conclusion in 1918, and it became clear that the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would lose, this desire to establish a new Jewish state in a region which had formed part of the Ottoman Empire, but which would now possibly become available for this Zionist project, became more plausible. Eventually, in the course of the late 1910s, Chaim and Magda entered into an intimate relationship, further suggesting that Magda was not possessed of the severe anti-Semitic feelings which many Europeans were in the first half of the 20th century. While Magda was seemingly not anti-Semitic, at least not in her youth, many in Germany were, and the loss of the First World War in November 1918 provided a conduit for this anti-Semitic feeling to expand further. As the war came to an end, Germany and many other countries across Europe descended into chaos. In Germany's case, this took the shape of a number of regional insurrections to try to establish communist or ultra-nationalist governments in cities like Berlin and Munich. Many of the latter were suffused with anti-Semitic views, parties such as the German National People's Party and the German Workers' Party. They also wished to overturn the post-war settlement, much of which had been imposed on Germany by the main victors in the war, Britain and France. Far from being magnanimous in victory, the governments in London and Paris had imposed crippling terms on Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the war between their nations to an end. Not only was Germany stripped of large amounts of territory, primarily in the east, but massive war reparations payments, which would take decades to pay back, were imposed, and Germany was further reduced to a second power status by having major restrictions imposed on its military and being forced to accept the occupation of the industrialized Ruhr and Rhineland regions of Western Germany by French and Belgian troops. All of this led to several years of pronounced political unrest in Germany between 1919 and 1923, much of it driven by war veterans disillusioned by events and willing to see Germany's plight being the result of a vast conspiracy perpetuated by an alliance of Jews and communists. Magda was, however, insulated from the unrest which was striking much of Germany in the early 1920s, for in 1920 she had met Günther Quandt, a German industrialist. Quandt was nearly twice Magda's age, having been born in 1881, but he was very rich. The Quandt family acquired a number of lucrative contracts to supply the German military with uniforms and other materiel during the war, and once the conflict ended, Günther had used the capital generated during the mid-1910s to acquire stakes in a number of companies such as BMW, a car manufacturer which was originally founded in 1916 to develop airplane engines for the nascent German Air Force. He and Magda married in 1921 after a short courtship, and within a few months a son named Harold was born on the 1st of November 1921. It was, though, an ill-fated union. Magda, in her early 20s, soon drifted away from Günther, who was in his early 40s, and often away from home on business. Moreover, Quandt had 2 biological children from his previous marriage and had also adopted 3 children after a deceased friend had passed. As altruistic as Günther's actions might have been, Magda resented having to suddenly raise 6 children while her husband traveled Germany and Europe. Magda and Günther's marriage continued to deteriorate in the years that followed. By the mid-1920s, she was handing over much of the responsibility for raising the children to their extensive household staff, while she engaged in a busy social life. Once the political turmoil of the early 1920s subsided in Germany, Berlin emerged as the cultural capital of the continent, and as a smart, well-educated young woman with no financial limitations, Magda was anxious to enjoy what the city had to offer. She was also soon engaged in extramarital affairs, which were relatively easy to cover up while her husband was out of town. The subterfuge could not last forever, though, given her husband's extensive business connections around Berlin. Thus, eventually in 1928, Günther learned of one of her relationships with a student nearer her own age. He promptly initiated divorce proceedings. In order to finalize the split quickly in 1929, he agreed to a large financial settlement, which effectively meant that Magda became a financially independent and newly divorced young woman at the age of 27. The divorce agreement also stipulated that Magda would raise the only biological child she had with Günther, Harold, until he was 14 years old in 1935, after which he would be sent to learn the family business under the tutelage of his father. Magda's first marriage was not the only thing which was collapsing in the late 1920s. While Germany's politics had been tortuous back in 1921 when she had married Günther, it had recovered substantially in the mid-1920s, entering a period of new prosperity and social cohesion driven by an international economic boom, one which has led economic historians to characterize the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties. As Germany's war reparations payments became manageable, the economy stabilized and people returned to work. The support that groups like the Freikorps and other ultra-nationalist organizations had enjoyed in the immediate aftermath of the First World War dried up. A sign of this was seen in one of the most prominent groups in southern Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis. These were founded in the city of Munich in Bavaria back in 1920 and had gained a substantial enough following in the area during the tumultuous years of the early 1920s. However, when they attempted an insurrection to seize control of Munich in November 1923, it failed to ignite popular support and was quickly suppressed. Moreover, when their organization was re-legalized in 1925, they could only ever obtain a minuscule vote in German national elections. The days of extremist politics seemed to have left post-war Germany. 1929 changed all of that. Right around the time that Magda's divorce from Quandt was finalized, the economic boom of the 1920s came to a crashing halt as the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City were hammered throughout the autumn. Within weeks, a seismic ripple was spreading across the Americas and Europe as economies were shaken to their core. The Great Depression, a period of several years in the early 1930s when tens of millions of people lost their jobs, their life savings, and their economic prospects, followed. Germany, which still had its massive war reparations payments to contend with, was particularly badly impacted, and as the economic damage spread, Germans began once again turning to the extremist politicians they had once viewed as plausible contenders for power 10 years earlier. Incredibly, when new Reichstag elections were held in September 1930, the Nazis increased their share of the national vote from just over 2.5% in 1928 to over 18%, making them the second largest political party in Germany. By 1931, they were growing to unprecedented heights, and every German seemed to be considering joining the Nazis or attending a party rally to see what their leader, Adolf Hitler, had to say about Germany's plight. Magda was an early convert to this new political party. She had begun taking an interest in the Nazis in the summer of 1930, attending meetings in Berlin. It was here that she first heard Joseph Goebbels, the head of the propaganda wing of the party and the regional leader of the Nazis in Berlin for several years, speak at an event. She was evidently taken by his gifts as an orator and began volunteering at Goebbels' office in the capital. Under an entry for the 7th of November 1930, Goebbels noted in his diary that Magda was reorganizing his papers in his office. He had clearly taken a liking to her, and they began casually seeing each other. but this does not appear to have turned into a committed courtship until February 1931, while talks of their possible marriage had begun by the late spring. That Easter, they visited Hitler in Bavaria, while Joseph started to try to cultivate a relationship with Magda's son from her marriage to Quandt, Harold. As their courtship developed that summer, Magda's large apartment in Berlin even became a meeting point for some of the higher-ranking members of the Nazi Party, with Hitler visiting there on occasion. It was the beginning of her entry into the world of the party, which would soon come to dominate Germany. Magda and Joseph's relationship was certainly not without its problems. As early as April 1931, ominous signs were developing. They argued regularly from the very earliest days of knowing each other. A familiar pattern emerged in this. Magda would go missing for a while, not returning his calls as she visited friends or was otherwise indisposed. Then Goebbels would become incredibly jealous and controlling. All of this was compounded as he became aware of the fact that her first marriage had come to an end on the back of Magda's infidelities. He would find it difficult in the months that followed to overlook this, and matters were not helped by the fact that Hitler himself seemed to have taken an interest in Magda after meeting her on several occasions. How much of this was real and how much of it was Goebbels' imagining is hard to say, but the relationship continued to be strained into the autumn of 1931, with his jealous outbursts creating tension. Yet these episodes were punctuated by weeks in which everything went smoothly, and in September they determined to move the date of their proposed marriage closer. Part of the reason for this, as biographers of Goebbels have noted, was that a peculiar arrangement was developing whereby Hitler was as anxious to have his propaganda chief and Magda marry as Joseph or Magda themselves were. For Hitler, whose sexual relationships were always of a peculiar nature, the couple would act as a kind of alternative first family within the Nazi hierarchy, removing the necessity of him marrying any time soon himself. Whatever the exact reasons for all this, we do know for sure that Magda and Joseph determined to marry sooner rather than later that autumn and moved the date forward to December 1931. Magda personally asked Hitler to act as the witness at their wedding, to which he agreed. Despite all this, several blazing arguments occurred between her and Joseph in the late autumn, one brought on by Joseph's discovery that Magda had been born out of wedlock, an issue which still carried a significant social stigma in the 1930s. On another occasion, Joseph was introduced to Magda's ex-husband Gunther Quandt, who had also decided to join the Nazis in the early 1930s, and whose business dealings would benefit enormously from becoming a member of the party in years to come. Goebbels expected to dislike him, but was surprised not to. Instead, a few days later, it was a few ill-thought-out words between he and Magda which triggered yet another argument. One would think that the signs were clear that the marriage should not go ahead, but Hitler wished for them to marry, and by the early winter, Magda knew that she was pregnant. And so it was that on the 19th of December, Magda and Joseph Goebbels were married at a Quandt family estate, which Magda had acquired the use of in her divorce settlement in Severin in Mecklenburg. Hitler acted as a witness, with Goebbels' sister Maria acting as a bridesmaid. Married life would prove just as tempestuous as their courtship and engagement had been. Magda and Joseph were married just as the Nazis were nearing the precipice of power in Germany. The party membership had continued to grow exponentially in 1931 and into 1932, but without fresh Reichstag elections, its new popularity could not be translated into dominance of the political system. That opportunity finally presented itself in July 1932, when new national elections were held. In these, the Nazis emerged as the largest party in the country, garnering 37% of the vote and winning 230 seats in the Reichstag. Still, the centrist parties tried to prevent their rise to power, cobbling together a minority government of technocrats. However, this could not function effectively, and as the economic situation continued to deteriorate, an impasse was reached by the start of 1933. That January, an agreement was struck amongst elements of the centre-right of the political establishment, whereby Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany, and several ministerial briefs would be granted to senior Nazi political figures. The idea was for a broad coalition to try to temper and control the Nazis in government, but this proved farcical. Within weeks, Hitler, Goebbels and others monopolized power in the hands of the Nazis by engineering an artificial political emergency and using it as the basis for the passage of laws allowing them to rule by decree. By the summer of 1933, the German Republic was effectively dead, and in its place, a one-party fascist state ruled by the Nazis had emerged. The ascent of the Nazis to power in the first months of 1933 completely changed the dynamics of Magda's life. In mid-March, Joseph was appointed as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He was now in charge of a vast array of aspects of German life. At its heart, the ministry's goal was to indoctrinate the German people into the ideology of Nazism, with its goals of reaching back to a mythical time when the German people had been pure and immensely powerful. In order to do this, Goebbels and his officials were determined to highlight that Nazism's success was confronted by many enemies, particularly the Jewish people and the communists, who were in league with each other to try to destroy Germany. Through the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Goebbels would deploy everything from radio broadcasts and films in the cinema to posters and newspaper slogans in the years ahead to try to mold the German people into Nazism's image, uniting the nation for a coming war of revenge for what had happened in the First World War. This position made Goebbels one of the most powerful figures in Germany overnight, and Magda became an influential figure herself within Berlin society as a consequence. While her husband was running the propaganda wing of the Nazi state, Magda became something of a poster woman for Nazi ideology towards women. This was backward-looking. It argued that the place of German women was in the home, raising the Aryan soldiers for the wars to come to ensure German domination of Europe. Thus, for instance, German women were precluded from working in certain sectors of society such as higher education from the mid-1930s onwards, and this was gradually expanded in the years that followed to include senior roles within the medical field, nursing excluded, and within politics. Admittedly, though, it should be noted that this was hardly unique in Western society at the time, and many supposedly developed countries still did not even allow women to vote in the 1930s. However, there is no doubting that the Nazis had a regressive attitude towards women's rights. Instead of working, the idealized Nazi German woman should focus her energies on being a wife and mother, and facilitating her children's education and her husband's career. Magda was prominent in promoting this ideal. Shortly after the Nazis seized power, she stated, quote, "German women were excluded from 3 professions, the army, as elsewhere in the world, the government, and the judiciary. If a German girl must choose between marriage or a career, she will always be encouraged to marry, because that is what is best for a woman." Thus, Mrs. Goebbels became a figurehead of Nazi ideological attitudes towards women from early on in the regime's time in power. She was also considerably involved in the National Socialist Women's League. This was established in October 1931 in response to claims that the Nazis did not appeal enough to female voters. However, once the party seized power, it evolved into an instrument to promote Nazi ideological ideas concerning women's role in society. It fostered the Nazi ideological view of women and organized lectures and events to promote these. Magda appeared at many events of the League as the figurehead of the Nazi female leadership. The League also published a magazine, the National Socialist Women's Monitor, which bizarrely interspersed articles offering advice to German women on housekeeping and motherhood, with pieces designed to promote the idea of Germany acquiring new lands in Eastern Europe and the development of a Greater Germany. Magda Goebbels featured in several issues over the years. Overall, the reach of the League was extensive, with over 2 million German women being members by the late 1930s, and with the National Socialist Women's Monitor having a circulation of 1.9 million copies by that time. All of this amounted to Magda becoming a kind of pseudo-First Lady of the Third Reich during the 1930s. Many of the senior members of the Nazi regime were either not married or had home lives which did not lend themselves well to being under the public gaze. Hitler himself was a bachelor. From the time that he became Chancellor of Germany, he was involved in an increasingly committed relationship with a photographer named Eva Braun, but the relationship was strained in its own way. Braun was over 20 years younger than the Nazi leader, and she had attempted suicide at least once early on in their courtship. As such, Hitler determined not to marry her during the 1930s, and they did not have children. In the face of this, Magda was often conceived of by German society at the time as a kind of surrogate First Lady, and indeed by the late 1930s, she was the recipient of a steady stream of correspondence from women all over Germany, petitioning her on a range of matters in much the same way in which a First Lady would often be within other countries. This impression of Magda was also partly driven by the prominence which she had as a mother within the regime. The Goebbels ended up having 6 children in the first 9 years of their marriage. Magda had already been pregnant when she and Joseph were wed, and in 1932 she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Helga. 5 more children followed, 1 son and 4 more daughters. These were Hildegard in 1934, Helmut in 1935, Holdine in 1937, Hedwig in 1938, and finally Heidrun in 1940. Each child's name started with an H, and it has been speculated, probably with complete accuracy, that Magda and Joseph elected to adopt this convention in an act of sycophancy towards Hitler, whose name started with H. As they grew up, the Goebbels' children became surrogate first children within the Third Reich, in much the same way that Magda had become a pseudo-First Lady in the absence of Hitler being married. Already by 1937, Helga and Hildegard, the 2 eldest of their children, were being photographed at Nazi Party events, and this tendency only increased over the years. Often it had a deeply sinister edge. For instance, in 1939, Joseph Goebbels filmed his children in a playful family scene, which was subsequently used in a Nazi propaganda video to promote the idea that handicapped or disabled children should be euthanized. Later, when the Nazis enveloped Europe in war, the Goebbels' children were used dozens of times per year in films and photo opportunities to show how normal life was continuing in Germany despite the conflict in France and Eastern Europe.
Throughout these years, as they were rising to become the face of Nazi family values, Joseph and Magda were also benefiting financially from his rise to power. On top of his ministerial salary and other prerequisites, Goebbels received an extensive allowance from the Nazi Party, which Hitler had personally sanctioned. This allowed them to finance the purchase of a large mansion in the exclusive suburb of Wannsee outside Berlin. By 1936, a motorboat, a Mercedes sports car, and a limousine had been added to the mix. Then Joseph sold the future contract rights to publish his extensive diaries to the Nazi Party's publishing house, Air Verlag. The contract stipulated these would be published 20 years after his death, in return for which Goebbels received a one-off payment of 250,000 Reichsmarks and 100,000 marks every year thereafter. With all of this newfound wealth, Magda was able to begin ostentatiously decorating the villa in Wannsee, and the house became the scene of many lavish parties held for the Nazi top brass in the capital from the mid-1930s onwards. A summer home on the riverine island of Schwanenwerder, not far from Berlin, was also acquired, while in addition Joseph acquired a smaller house in the capital. In time, other homes were acquired elsewhere across Germany. The family needed for nothing when it came to their children and enjoyed the robust trappings of wealth which Joseph's position afforded them following the Nazis' seizure of power.
Yet all was not marital bliss. The primary reason why Joseph obtained a second house in Berlin was to use it for his very many extramarital affairs, a large number of which were with the actresses who were employed in his propaganda films. One in particular became a cause of scandal. In 1937, Joseph began seeing Lida Barova, a Czech actress who had moved to Berlin a few years earlier. By this time, the fights which had punctuated the Goebbels relationship at regular intervals from before they were ever even married had begun to weigh on both parties, and often when he was home from his admittedly extensive work commitments, he and Magda would sit in silence, rather than risk the possibility of a new argument. Magda was not innocent herself in any of this, and she had also had an affair with a zealous Nazi, Kurt Lüdecker, in 1933. before he fled Germany shortly afterwards, having come under suspicion by the party for his links to the leadership of the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazis, whose top figures were purged in 1934. These affairs were problematic, but when Joseph started seeing Barova, he went so far as to be seen in public with her. For one of the country's senior ministers, it wasn't long before word of this got around, and Magda became aware of what was happening. When she did, she turned to Hitler for help, and on the 15th of August 1938 met with him to discuss the situation at length. The following day, the Führer had a meeting with Joseph, whereat he demanded that he end the affair. But, in a rare act of defiance, Goebbels didn't do so, despite agreeing to. Things only became more strained thereafter. When Kurt Hanke, one of Goebbels' senior staff members, became caught up in the quarrel between his superior and his wife, Magda and he ended up having a brief affair themselves. By the late autumn, Hitler had decided to make a dramatic intervention. He effectively put Hanke on leave and sent him away from Berlin, while he had the secret police, including the Gestapo, start following Barova constantly around the capital. By the end of the early winter, she was so disturbed by this that she stopped making public appearances and fled back to Prague a few weeks later. To smooth over public opinion, a family photo of the Goebbels and their children, with Hitler standing between Magda and Joseph, was taken in October 1938 and widely distributed. The idea was clear. The perfect first family was healed once again, but the reality was far different. From the winter of 1938 onwards, Magda and Joseph were increasingly distant from one another. He was often away from Berlin for work, and when he was there, she often retreated to various houses which they had acquired elsewhere in Germany, or to rural spas to recuperate from a number of serious health problems which were plaguing her, not least owing to the stress of 6 pregnancies in less than 10 years. Thus, while the scandal of Joseph's relationship with Barova had abated, Magda's marriage to Joseph could never be said to have been a happy one thereafter. Not that it ever had been, although the public image said otherwise. While Magda and Joseph's relationship was declining to new lows, Nazi Germany was beginning an inexorable drift towards war. A war of revenge to reverse the outcome of the First World War was always a central aim of the Nazis from the very inception of their movement in the early 1920s. Once they seized power in 1933, they began preparing for this eventuality. Firstly, the country began to remilitarize extensively from early 1935 onwards, when Hitler and other senior figures within the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, made it clear that they intended to begin conscripting in the region of 500,000 soldiers. This was a clear and egregious breach of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, and which stipulated that Germany henceforth was to restrict its armed forces to 100,000 men. Additionally, Hermann Göring announced the creation of a new air force known as the Luftwaffe, which was also a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Finally, in the spring of 1936, the German armed forces moved into the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized since the mid-1920s, when French and Belgian occupying forces had left the region. By this time, Hitler and his closest allies, such as Goebbels, were beginning to consider that they might bring forward the proposed start date of a new European war from the early 1940s to sometime in the late 1930s. The spring of 1938 witnessed a rapid escalation of the aggressive Nazi foreign policy. Part of Nazi ideology centered on the creation of a Greater Germany, one which would necessarily include the German-speaking and ethnically German peoples of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia and Poland. Indeed, as soon as the Nazis had seized power in Berlin in 1933, they had begun actively seeking to overthrow the far-right Austrian nationalist regime in Austria. Eventually, this culminated in a campaign of massive public pressure on Austria in the spring of 1938, aimed at forcing the government in Vienna into accepting a union with Germany. Magda would have been preoccupied by this, as Joseph's work in late 1937 and into 1938 focused increasingly on leading the propaganda drive to accept the Anschluss, or union of the two countries, one which was finally completed in March 1938 when German tanks rolled into Vienna and succeeded in bloodlessly forcing through a referendum on the matter. In the months that followed, propaganda efforts switched to the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, a region in the west of the country where the majority of people were German-speaking. When an international conference was convened in Munich that September to decide on the fate of the Sudetenland, Joseph and Magda remained in Berlin. But Joseph's wave of propaganda videos released from the capital as Hitler was overseeing the conference did much to galvanize public opinion in support of the annexation of Sudetenland. A few days later, the British and French capitulated as Germany continued to expand to dominate Central Europe without ever firing a shot.
In the weeks that followed the Munich conference and the annexation of the Sudetenland, Magda was privy to Joseph writing a new book rapidly. The proposed title was Adolf Hitler, a Man Who Is Making History, and the propaganda minister intended for it to be published in 1939, but it was blocked, presumably by Hitler himself, who did not wish for it to appear. While Magda would have been surprised to see her husband's efforts in this respect frustrated, there was no doubt that Hitler was to go on to make history in all the wrong ways in 1939. Unsatisfied with the Sudetenland, the Nazis effectively invaded Czechoslovakia in the spring of that year and carved it up into different occupied territories which effectively became part of the growing Third Reich. By now, Britain and France, who had insisted at Munich that there could be no further land concessions to Germany, were beginning to rearm in preparation for a war with the Nazis, which was now inevitable. They did not launch it following the annexation of Czechoslovakia, but when the familiar claims on a neighbour's territories emerged in the weeks that followed concerning Poland, both London and Paris made it clear that any breach of the Eastern European nation's sovereignty would also effectively be a declaration of war by Berlin on the Western European nations. Thus, when Hitler ordered the German military over the eastern border into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had commenced.
Magda and Joseph continued to benefit from their close relationship with Hitler in the early stages of the war. Joseph's propaganda was especially necessary on the home front in 1939 and 1940. As the Nazi regime sought to galvanize the German people in support of the war effort and depict Germany's enemies as constituting an existential threat, and in some strange way, the aggressor in the conflict. Magda was happy to make public appearances in line with the continuing perception of her as the leading female figure within the regime. Her and Joseph's marriage remained icy throughout this period. Following Hitler's intervention during the crisis of 1938, the marriage developed largely into one of convenience. By 1940, they had 6 children together. Both benefited enormously from a material standpoint from being in the Führer's good graces, and once they accepted that Hitler would not tolerate any further public infidelities or any possibility of them divorcing each other, the pair accepted a kind of muted marriage arrangement. Indeed, in Joseph's diaries, there is a marked decline in the references to arguments and fights between himself and Magda from the late 1930s onwards. Thus, once both accepted the situation, a curious calm seems to have settled over the relationship, one which had never been there previously, even during their courtship.
While Magda's marriage to Joseph continued to oscillate between periods of stability and major tension, Germany's fortunes in the war, which it had cast Europe into in the autumn of 1939, could not have been more positive. Poland had been quickly overrun and conquered in the course of September and early October 1939. Thereafter, the Nazis had prepared for a swift conquest of Western Europe in 1940, but even Hitler was surprised at the speed with which his tank divisions and land troops were able to conquer the Low Countries and France in May and June of 1940. Denmark and Norway had already been swiftly occupied through targeted military operations in the spring, so that by the late summer of 1940, only Britain stood against Nazi Germany in Europe. It too might have been conquered if the Nazis had continued with their air and naval bombardment of the country, which was initiated in the autumn of that year. But early in 1941, Hitler became determined to switch his attentions eastwards and initiate a war with Nazism's great ideological enemy, the Bolshevik Communists of the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in military history, involving 3 million German soldiers, commenced, and it proved enormously successful to begin with. By the early winter of 1941, German divisions had advanced to near Moscow and Leningrad. There was now a real possibility that the war would end in Nazi domination of the continent of Europe. As all of this was occurring, Magda took on a leading role as a symbol of how Nazi women at home in Germany should behave while their husbands and sons were fighting on the fronts or leading the war effort from military headquarters elsewhere. For instance, she trained as a Red Cross nurse shortly after the war began and appeared in many photo opportunities in the months that followed to emphasize this role. Much was also made of the fact that her eldest child, her son Harold, from the marriage to Günther Quandt, was serving as a pilot in the Luftwaffe. Moreover, because Hitler was not married to his partner Eva Braun, and it was consequently not appropriate given the standards of the time for her to entertain visiting dignitaries and heads of state and their wives, the responsibility for doing so often fell to Magda and the Goebbels. This was a time-consuming endeavor in the early 1940s as the new heads of puppet regimes and vassal states which had been created across Europe were required to travel to Berlin and bend the knee, figuratively speaking, to the Nazi leaders in the capital of the Reich. A much more controversial issue concerned the Nazi states' changing attitudes towards the Reich's Jewish population and how Magda responded to this. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, there were approximately 500,000 Jews living in Germany. This was a relatively small percentage of the overall population, and the favored policy of the party during the remainder of the 1930s was to make life as uncomfortable as possible for these 500,000 German Jews, with the ultimate goal of forcing them to leave the country. Thus, under the Nuremberg laws, Jews in Germany were broadly robbed of their citizenship and an immense amount of rights. Pogroms followed, and violence and indiscriminate arrests of Jews in the country were escalating massively in 1938 and 1939. And then, things went even further. A huge proportion of Europe's Jews lived in Poland in the 1930s, over 3 million. Consequently, after the annexation of Poland in the opening months of the war, more extreme attitudes began to develop, and by the summer of 1941, it had been decided by Hitler and others that a policy of mass murder or genocide would be initiated. Millions of Jews from across the Reich were to be detained and transported to a series of death camps in Poland and surrounding regions, and there they would be gassed to death. The Holocaust of Europe's Jews would eventually result in the death of approximately 6 million people. As the wife of one of the most senior figures within the Nazi regime, Magda cannot but have been aware of what was now unfolding in Poland and elsewhere. There is a striking element to all of this when we consider her background. Magda had been raised for several years in her youth as an adopted daughter of Richard Friedlander, while she had also briefly dated Chaim Arlosoroff, a leading Jewish Zionist in her youth. She seems not to have been possessed of any anti-Semitic feeling herself, and once, when asked about the persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi regime, she simply stated that it was Hitler's wish and that her husband had to go along with it, although this was a complete distortion of Joseph Goebbels' own committed anti-Semitism. But what is striking is that Magda did very little to intervene to save the lives of any Jewish people she had known. She might possibly have provided anonymous aid to the Franks family, who had themselves provided help to Magda and her mother way back in 1914 when they were travelling to Berlin from Brussels after they had been deported from Belgium at the start of the First World War. But for her former adoptive father, Richard Friedlander, she did nothing. She had ceased to have any contact with him years earlier. He was eventually arrested and is believed to have perished in a Nazi concentration camp in 1939. In many ways, the Holocaust was initiated because the Nazis had come to believe that victory in the war was now inevitable. The endless succession of striking military victories, which occurred between September 1939 and the autumn of 1941, had convinced Hitler and his acolytes that they would soon be triumphant across Europe. Then they would have no one to answer to for their genocidal approach to the Jews. But this hubris was soon countered. Even as the final plans for the Holocaust were being put in place, the war in Russia was beginning to turn against the Germans. That winter, the Nazi armies failed to take Moscow and Leningrad, and slowly the full might of the Soviet Union was mobilized against the German invasion. In tandem, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union in December 1941,
following an unprovoked attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by Nazi Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan. Faced with this combined alliance, the war effort began to turn in 1942, and by early 1943 had shifted dramatically. That spring and summer, the Russians turned the tide and started pushing the Germans back into Ukraine and Poland, while the Western Allies opened a southern front in Sicily after winning the battle for control of North Africa. Moreover, the United States had agreed that victory over Nazi Germany in Europe would take priority over the campaign in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. It was all very ominous for the Nazi regime.
As this succession of reverses occurred from the winter of 1941 onwards, Magda's relationship with Hitler and the Nazi cause in general entered a period of contradictory fluxes. On the one hand, for her, as for so many others in Germany, the sheen of invincibility that had once surrounded the Führer and the Nazi mission in the early stages of the war had very much been tarnished. The best efforts of her husband's propaganda machine aside, on more than one occasion she was seen to be openly dismissive of Hitler's views and statements while at social events in Berlin, while in 1944 she was willing to state in public that the Nazi leader had become delusional in many of his views on the war, a dangerous statement to make in public in an authoritarian state where secret police were everywhere. But by then, Magda had her reasons for some personal bitterness at the war situation. Her eldest child from her first marriage, Harold, had been captured while fighting against the Allied invasion of Italy and was being held in a prisoner of war camp from which he would not be released until 1947. Magda would never see him again. Yet, in stark contrast to these more negative sentiments, were occasions on which Magda could display a zealous commitment to the Nazi cause. When Joseph gave a famous speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin on the 18th of February 1943, in which he had whipped up the crowd and asked them fervently if they wanted total war, Magda dutifully attended with their two eldest children, Helga and Hildegard. Moreover, whatever her misgivings in private might have been, she continued to visit Hitler regularly when he was in Berlin, and remained one of his closest female confidants. All in all, her response to the declining war situation and towards Hitler was changeable and difficult to decipher.
If Magda did have a growing disillusionment with Hitler, then it was not unfounded. By 1944, the Führer was an increasingly delusional figure, one who rejected the sound strategic thinking of many of his generals in favor of dubious military strategies he favored himself. He continued to cling to the ideological belief that the Western Allies would soon have a major falling out with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his ministers. Once this occurred, Hitler reasoned, Britain and the US would find common cause against the Bolsheviks and Communists of the Soviet Union. This never occurred. Instead, in the summer of 1944, the Western Allies finally opened a Western front in northern France, which Stalin had long requested them to do, in order to draw German forces away from Eastern Europe, with three fronts now operating on the continent, one in Eastern Europe, one in Italy, and one in France. The Nazis began to rapidly relinquish control of the lands they had conquered since 1939. By the spring of 1945, the British, Americans, Canadians, and French were spreading out across Western Germany, occupying the Rhineland. But it was the Russians, who had moved over the River Elbe in northeastern Germany, which were the more pressing issue for families like the Goebbels. In the late spring of 1945, having surrounded Berlin, they began the last battle to take the German capital. Many senior Nazis contemplated fleeing Berlin at this point, but Magda and Joseph Goebbels ensconced themselves in the center of the city with Hitler.
As the Allies entered Germany, the Goebbels had removed their children from one of their country estates to Schwanenwerder Villa outside Berlin. From there, the sound of artillery and bombings could soon be heard far off in the distance, and the children were brought into Berlin itself. On the 22nd of April, as the Red Army was massing around Berlin and entering the main suburbs, the 6 children were brought to the Führerbunker in the center of the city, a bunker below the Reichschancellery. This was effectively the command center of what was left of the Third Reich. Hitler and his main staff had moved in here in January 1945. By late April, It had become a desperate place where a somber Hitler received final visits from some of the most senior Nazi Party members. In many instances, he merely dismissed them, asserting that they had failed him. However, the Goebbels were not amongst these. Zealously, Magda and Joseph were to remain here underground in central Berlin with the Führer until the very end. For his loyalty, Hitler changed the order of succession in a completely futile gesture, appointing Goebbels as his successor and renouncing Hermann Göring, who it had long been understood would succeed should Hitler die.
What followed in the last days of April and the 1st of May are relatively well known in the broad sense, but why they occurred with regard to the Goebbels family is perhaps less understood. Hitler had determined to take his own life rather than falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. Joseph Goebbels seemingly had a similar view, and in a cryptic message he had broadcast on German radio in late February 1945, he seems to have alluded to the idea that his children's lives would not be worth living if the Nazi cause perished. On the 15th of April, as the noose tightened on Berlin, he had published an article in the paper Das Reich, in which he again questioned if life would be worth living when the Third Reich finally fell. Thus, it appears that, for months leading up to the siege of Berlin, Joseph had been contemplating the possibility of suicide if the miracle of a falling out between the Allies did not occur and the Nazi regime was completely defeated. Whether he had discussed this or not with Magda is also unknown, but she herself seemingly alluded to plans to commit suicide and for her and Joseph to kill their children in the process in the final weeks of the war. Moreover, when several senior figures within the regime offered to help smuggle the children out of Berlin, Magda refused all offers. All of this suggests a plan which, while it might not have been entirely committed to, was at least premeditated and thought out as a possible option if the worst should happen. Whatever the motives or the background might have been, we do know precisely what did occur. As artillery bombardments were heard ever closer to central Berlin, and as the Führer bunker began to shake from explosions above, Hitler decided to marry his long-term partner Eva Braun on the night of the 29th of April. The following day, the Nazi leader and his bride committed suicide. For a brief time, Magda's husband now became the leader of the Third Reich as German Chancellor. His tenure of that office is really remembered for only one event in which Magda was the central protagonist. On the 1st of May, the 6 Goebbels children, Helga, who was 12 years old, Hildegard, who was 11, 9-year-old Helmut, 8-year-old Holdine, and Hedwig and Heidrun, who were just 6 and 4 years old respectively, were killed. Exactly how this occurred has been a matter of extensive debate. Some accounts later held that an SS dentist, Helmut Krünz, injected each of the children with morphine and that cyanide capsules were then crushed in their mouths once they had lost consciousness. Others suggest that Hitler's physician in his last weeks, Ludwig Stumpfegger, gave the children morphine or some other sedative in sweetened drinks, and they were then killed once this had an effect. But what is usually agreed is that it was Magda Goebbels who killed 6 of her 7 children on the 1st of May 1945, most likely by administering cyanide herself. Thereafter, Magda and Joseph proceeded upstairs to the garden of the Reichschancellery where they committed suicide. They appear to have swallowed cyanide pills and left orders with the SS guards with them that once the poison started to take effect, they were to shoot them, repeatedly if necessary. Their bodies were then doused in petrol and set alight. Just a day later, Soviet troops entered the Reichschancellery and found the charred remains of Magda and her husband still lying in the garden. The SS members there had apparently ignored orders to bury their remains once they had burned their corpses. The surface of the Reichschancellery building was secured that afternoon, and so it was not until the 3rd of May that Russian troops went down into the Führer bunker and discovered the 6 children lying dead in their beds, dressed in their nightclothes with ribbons in their hair. Their bodies were taken away for autopsy. It remains unclear to this day where or if they were buried by the Soviet authorities. The location of the remains of Magda and Joseph is also unknown. They, like those of several others from the bunker, were buried and exhumed again, several times over in the months that followed, as the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin appears to have changed his mind repeatedly about what should be done with them. As with their children, it is unclear where the remains of Magda and Joseph were buried or their final ashes deposited. Magda Goebbels was one of the most prominent figures involved in the Nazi regime. Having become interested in the party in 1930 in the aftermath of her first divorce, she quickly became involved with Joseph Goebbels and by 1931 was considering marriage to him. But the relationship was tempestuous from the beginning, and when they married in December of that year, it seemed as much at the behest of Hitler than out of any real desire to wed. The rise of the Nazis to power brought social status and wealth. Outwardly to German society, the Goebbels were the epitome of the perfect German family in the new Germany, with their brood of Aryan children and seemingly picture-perfect life. Furthermore, in the absence of Hitler having a wife, Magda became a surrogate first lady, appearing regularly in Nazi propaganda, often with her children. But behind the facade was a deeply troubled marriage, one in which both Magda and Joseph engaged in a string of affairs. When one of these became a potential source of scandal in 1938, Hitler intervened and made it clear that divorce was out of the question. In that sense, it was an unusual poster-first family. Magda's ideological approach to Nazism was just as contradictory. Here was a woman who had been partially raised by an adoptive Jewish father, who had dated a Jewish man in her youth, and who was clearly not possessed of much anti-Semitism, who in the 1930s nevertheless became the unofficial First Lady of the most anti-Semitic government to ever exist. Her attitude towards Hitler and the war could be similarly ambivalent, criticizing the Führer in front of friends, but acting as one of his closest female confidants at the same time. But most inexplicable of all was the perverse loyalty she displayed towards Hitler in the final days of the conflict. Rather than escaping with her 6 children from Berlin, which she could have done, she elected to bring them to Hitler's bunker. And on the 1st of May, the day after Hitler committed suicide, Magda Goebbels murdered her 6 children aged between 12 and 4 years of age before she and Joseph killed themselves. For Joseph, there can have been no hope of any fate other than arrest, trial, and execution in the aftermath of the war. But Magda would have probably escaped with a few years in jail, while her children were not guilty of any crimes. As such, her heinous act at the last moment was born not of necessity, but out of the fanatical and inexplicable loyalty which so many Germans developed towards Hitler and the Nazi cause. What do you think of Magda Goebbels? How can the contradictions in her personality and her decision to kill her own children be explained? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The woman known to history as Irma Grese was born on the 7th of October 1923 in the village of Vrechen in Mecklenburg, Germany. Her father was Alfred Grese, the overseer of a local estate and a supervisor of the estate's dairy. Her mother, Bertha Winter, was a homemaker who also managed the family's own produce garden and domestic animals. Irma Ilsa Ida Grese, as she was christened, grew up in a rural lowland area about 50 miles north of Berlin, a quiet and picturesque region of green fields, scattered forests and many lakes. The people who lived there were predominantly lower middle class agricultural workers, and the Grese family managed decently well financially, at least as well or perhaps slightly better than many of their neighbors. Irma was the third of 5 children. She had an older sister, Lieschen, an older brother, Alfred, and 2 younger siblings, her sister Helena and a baby brother, Otto. Few details are known about Irma Grese's early childhood, but it appears to have been fairly unremarkable. She played with her brothers and sisters, helped her mother with domestic chores, and attended the local elementary school. Irma was reportedly a shy, sensitive and anxious child, who always ran away from any conflicts with other children, or so her sister Helena said of her many years later. In March of 1933, when Irma was 9 years old, her elementary school underwent significant changes in its curriculum, just as every other school in Germany did following the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazi Party just 2 months prior. The principles and ideals of National Socialism, Aryan purity and race pollution were now benchmark educational standards. Historians and witnesses have differed over the Grese family's stance on the Nazi Party. Some accounts describe Alfred Grese as a stern, conservative, and devoutly church-going man who disliked Nazi politics. Others describe him as an opportunistic supporter of Hitler, one who perhaps did not care so much which party was in power, as long as they brought back some of the German pride and prosperity previous generations had known under the Kaiser. It is true that Alfred Grese did not join the Nazi Party until 1937, so perhaps this latter supposition is accurate. Grese did, however, become a local group leader for the Nazi Party in Vrechen after he joined the organization. Alfred and Bertha Grese had a difficult marriage that ultimately ended in tragedy. The family made decent money compared to others in their community, but with 5 children to clothe and feed, they must have found it challenging. Some accounts describe Alfred as an excessively heavy drinker and a hard disciplinarian who often employed physical punishment with his children. Oral accounts from the Grese family's old neighbors and acquaintances, however, claim this is not true. Alfred regularly frequented his local pub, but they insist he was quite friendly and jolly, and not a problematic or abusive drinker. What is known for certain is that in December of 1935, Bertha learned that Alfred had been having an affair with the daughter of a local pub owner. Bertha enlisted her children to help her clean the house from top to bottom. When everything was clean and neat, she sent her children out to fetch their father from the pub. While they were gone, she tried to take her own life by drinking hydrochloric acid, a commonly used cleaning product. When the family arrived home and found Bertha unconscious on her bed, they rushed her to the hospital. Bertha Grese lived for a few weeks before dying in hospital in January 1936. Irma was 12 years old when her mother died, and few, if any, details are known about how the family coped in the few years after Bertha's death. Oral accounts from old neighbors claim that Irma became quieter, more withdrawn, and tended to isolate herself from others. While other children were building friendships and experiencing their first romances, Irma reportedly could often be found sitting alone on a hillside, whistling softly to herself. Both Irma and her sister Helena soon conceived a desire to join the League of German Girls, the young women's branch of the Hitler Youth. Apparently, the Nazi indoctrination that the two sisters had been receiving at school for the past 5 years had had an effect. The League of German Girls was an organization designed to train young women to be party comrades, whether that meant marriage and prolific motherhood, training as a nurse, or defending the homeland as a member of one of the women's auxiliary branches of the SS. One historian has suggested that perhaps the League of German Girls and the Nazi Party offered a number of prospects beyond simple ideology that Irma and other young women like her may have found attractive. Nazi rhetoric glorified not only so-called Aryan Germans, but also claimed to value rural people and communities as the backbone of German society and the seat of German virtue. The League of German Girls offered isolated, frustrated, or angry young women the means to find identity, affirmation, and camaraderie, better career opportunities than could be accessed in their home communities, and the opportunity to meet and mix with many more people their own age. Membership would soon become mandatory for all German girls of Aryan ancestry. but initially Irma's father flatly refused to let her join the League. It is unclear why Alfred at first forbade his daughter to join the organization, especially since he became an official member of the Nazi Party himself in 1937. One account claims that the local League chapter was too far away and the route too dangerous for Irma to ride her bicycle to and from meetings alone. Whatever the reason, her father's refusal seems to have been the beginning of a rift between Irma and Alfred. In 1938, when she was 14, Irma dropped out of school to sign up for a government-administered youth labor program. She went to work at a dairy factory in nearby Fürstenberg for 6 months, and then worked at a small shop in Luschen for a further 6 months. In 1939, less than a year after Irma left school, Alfred Grese married again. His new wife brought 4 stepchildren from a previous marriage into the Grese family, and the couple later had another child together. 15-year-old Irma, who may not have come home at all throughout her previous year in the labor program, then left home for good. On the strength of a recommendation from her local chapter of the League of German Girls, Irma secured a position as a nurse apprentice at the Hohenluschen Sanatorium under the supervision and mentorship of the surgeon Dr. Karl Gebhardt, the infamous Nazi physician who would eventually be sentenced to death in 1948 at Nuremberg for medical atrocities. Hohenluschen had once been administered by the International Red Cross as a tuberculosis treatment facility. Since the establishment of Nazi rule, however, the hospital had become a research center. The Nazi military were especially interested in being able to effectively treat and cure serious battle injuries. Dr. Gebhardt was initially charged with determining the uses and effectiveness of sulfur drugs to treat gangrenous wounds, but soon moved on to experimentation with bone grafting and nerve repair. At Hohenluschen, on Karl Gebhardt's watch, unspeakably hideous and torturous experiments were carried out on Jewish women from the nearby Ravensbrück concentration camp. Irma Grese spent 2 years as an apprentice and assistant nurse in this hospital. While few, if any, details are known about her specific experiences there, she no doubt became more and more numb to the cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazi regime in such an environment, or worse, more accepting of it. She may also have become more and more indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, since Hohenluschen was also a convalescent home for ill or injured SS officers. Members of the Nazi High Command, including Albert Speer, Heydrich, and Rudolf Hess, convalesced there throughout the late 30s and in the early years of the Second World War. Gebhardt himself, as her supervisor, may have been a particularly intense ideological influence on Irma. Dr. Gebhardt was an old campaigner for the Nazi Party and had marched with the brown shirts in the streets of Berlin during the early 1920s. Irma was eventually let go from her position at Hohenluschen Hospital. Apparently, after 2 years, she had not improved sufficiently or shown enough competence at her job to become a full-fledged nurse. Irma later wrote that she was particularly disappointed to have failed her apprenticeship and had sincerely wanted to enter the nursing profession. Dr. Gebhardt suggested that she apply for a position as a prison guard at the nearby Ravensbrück concentration camp and referred Irma to a friend of his in the camp's administration. At the time, 17-year-old Irma was too young to be recruited into the SS and was instructed to reapply after she turned 18. Consequently, between the fall of 1941 and the summer of 1942, Irma returned to her previous job at the Fürstenberg dairy factory. In July of 1942, she joined the women's branch of the SS and began prison guard training at the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück. The recruitment of women to military, law enforcement, or manufacturing jobs was quite contrary to the official Nazi stance on women's roles in German society. National Socialist ideology praised German women who upheld traditional values, married and produced as many children as possible. Yet, as the war advanced, Germany was forced, like every other nation engaged in the war at the time, to recruit women in order to replace factory workers who were drafted into the military. They also needed qualified nurses to care for their wounded. Additionally, as the concentration camps began to shift from forced labor camps to killing centers by 1942, and more satellite camps were established, more and more SS matrons were recruited as women's sections were established in the camps. Women were not permitted to become full-fledged members of the SS, but were designated as SS assistants. Nonetheless, the women who trained at Ravensbrück to become concentration camp guards between 1942 and 1944 were subject to the same standards and expectations as the men, and received training that was virtually identical to the training undergone by male guards at Dachau's model camp. Guard training took 3 weeks, a seemingly brief period of time, but often long enough to produce dramatic behavioral changes and harrowing results. Little is known about Irma's specific experiences during guard training, but her rapid promotion within little more than a year of completing her training speaks volumes about how effectively she may have absorbed the cruel and brutal lessons of the camps. One of the senior matrons at Ravensbrück, Dorothea Binz, may have been a significant influence on Irma, although it is important to note that this is no more than a supposition. However, Binz exhibited at Ravensbrück many of the same vicious and sadistic behaviors and tactics with which Irma Grese would later come to be associated at Auschwitz. According to the testimony of survivors at the Ravensbrück and Auschwitz concentration camps, Grese resembled Binz in a number of ways. Both kept a loaded gun on their person at all times, frequently using it to summarily execute prisoners or to strike terror. This weapon was the only one officially used by the SS, but it was not the only one they employed. Like Binz, Grese also carried a whip at all times, which she used perhaps more frequently than she did the gun. Further, both Binz and Grese sometimes made their rounds throughout the camps, leading a trained German shepherd dog, which they might command to terrorize, attack, maim, or kill prisoners. Finally, according to multiple witnesses, both Binz and Grese engaged in sadistic sexual behavior toward their victims. Such acts are beyond any civilized person's grasp of humanity. While this behavior may have been even more extreme than that of the average camp guard, the vast majority did absorb the systematic program of beatings, starvation, purposely appalling conditions, and humiliating indignity with which the Nazi regime intended to demoralize, defeat, and ultimately kill those they considered subhuman enemies of the state. Whether they were Jews, Slavs, Roma peoples, homosexual men and women, or religious or ideological dissidents. Few camp guards ultimately proved to be as monstrous as Irma Grese. But on the other hand, those who refused to treat prisoners with cruelty were so rare as to be negligible. Most guards adapted to seeing prisoners abused without flinching during training, and most would willingly and even viciously beat prisoners when being watched by other guards. SS camp training sought to cultivate above all a hardness or toughness in its guards. Hitler himself spoke of the need to strip away all weakness and tenderness from Germany's youth to make them violently active, dominating, brutal, and indifferent to pain. "I want to see in their eyes," Hitler wrote once, "the gleam of pride and independence of the beast of prey." SS camp guards were trained to watch prisoners constantly for any signs of individual or organized sabotage. Morning and evening prisoner roll calls were used to model expected guard behavior and were a major component of training. These sessions could sometimes last for hours, with prisoners standing silently in lines in the baking sun or the numbing frost for inspection, and receiving demeaning, cruel, and sometimes even fatal punishments for any perceived infraction, however minor or even non-existent. Guards in training watched their superiors beat and sometimes kill prisoners for supposedly breaking camp rules or for not working hard enough. Finally, guards in training were instructed never to pursue any personal or human contact with prisoners. Even a casual conversation was strictly forbidden and completely taboo. The beginners usually appeared frightened upon first contact with the camp. One survivor of Ravensbrück recalled, "It took some time to attain the level of cruelty and debauchery of their seniors. Some of us made a rather grim little game of measuring the time it took for a new Aufseherin to win her stripes. One little Aufseherin, 20 years old, was at first so ignorant of proper camp manners that she said 'excuse me' when walking in front of a prisoner. She needed exactly 4 days to adopt the requisite manner, although it was totally new for her." Magda Hellinger, a survivor of Auschwitz, was the prisoner functionary of Camp C, assigned to assist Irma Grese when she first arrived at the women's camp there. Magda recalled her first meeting with Grese, during which the 19-year-old appeared rather juvenile and awkward, her hair in 2 braids hanging over her shoulders. Magda was shocked to see her again after several months of working in a different part of the camp. She appeared to have hardened and to have become more vicious and confident in it, patrolling the camp with her uniform flawlessly tailored, her boots shining, her hair and makeup impeccable, and her weapons at the ready. In the decades since World War II, historians, psychologists, and behavioral scientists have proposed a number of theories seeking to explain how so many SS camp staff could have been trained so effectively to adopt and employ such vicious and inhumane treatment on helpless people. Indoctrination is a fairly familiar process to such professionals, but some are quick to point out that particular groups of people can be more easily indoctrinated than others, and such groups seem to have been primarily targeted for recruitment to the Camp Guard division of the SS. A sizable proportion of the nearly 30,000 SS men and women who became Nazi concentration camp guards were working class, minimally educated young people between 18 and 26 years of age. They largely came from rural or provincial areas with few opportunities, areas which had been hit hardest by Germany's economic woes since the end of the First World War. They had the so-called correct heritage as Aryan Germans, and the Nazis told them they were superior to all non-Aryan peoples. It was in these rural parts of the country, rather than in the cities, which the Nazis labeled decadent and subversive, that Hitler's message of Aryan supremacy, hate, and murderous racism often landed hardest. These young people had swelled the ranks of the various branches of the Hitler Youth in the years before the war. Irma Grese fits this description remarkably well. An angry, isolated, and bitter nobody from nowhere, she had failed her nursing training, and her future as likely no more than a menial laborer stretched predictably before her. The sudden elevation of such people to relatively prestigious government positions, with the power of life and death over those they blamed for all the country's troubles, resulted in some of the worst documented crimes of violence and murder in human history. It is important to remember also that virtually all female SS camp guards were not drafted, as women in the war auxiliaries were, but actually volunteered for service in the camps. A government advertisement seeking the recruitment of SS camp guards appeared in newspapers in 1938. "You only have to watch over prisoners," the ad read. The advertisement also promised that a food allotment, a well-furnished official residence, and an official uniform would be provided along with an employee salary, which would increase on a schedule. Once she finished her guard training, Irma was employed as an SS Aufseherin, or matron, for nearly 7 months at Ravensbrück, where she promptly passed her probation and reportedly impressed and even surpassed her superiors with her easy adjustment to the camp's vicious and violent regime. In February of 1943, Irma went home to Vrecken for a visit. While it cannot be confirmed for certain, this may have been the first time in nearly 4 years that she was received in her family's house. Irma was due to travel to Poland within a few weeks to take up her new post in the women's section of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. According to accounts from 3 Grese family members, including Irma herself, this meeting initially went well. Alfred and Irma behaved amicably with each other, despite their previous clashes, and he apparently seemed proud of her for the position she had secured, as well as impressed with her smart uniform and above-average compensation package. The household calm did not last long. Allegedly, just a few days after Irma arrived, one of her younger stepsisters went crying to Alfred that Irma had torn the head and limbs off one of her dolls. This reportedly led to a confrontation between Alfred and Irma, which dissolved what goodwill still remained between them. It is unclear whether Alfred fully understood just what his daughter's job as a prison guard entailed, or if that played any role in his rejection of her. According to Helena Grese, Irma had been immediately angry and insolent with her father when he confronted her. Helena claimed Alfred was also upset about Irma's involvement with the SS and the prison camps. But this statement should be treated with skepticism, since many Nazi-supporting families sought to hide their support and acceptance of the party after the war. Irma herself stated that during the course of this confrontation with her father, one of her younger brothers had run into the room carrying Irma's pistol, which he had found among her personal belongings, and playfully took aim at his father. Alfred, Irma said, had quickly and carefully taken the gun away from his son and struck Irma across the face with it. Irma reportedly collected her belongings and departed her family's home immediately, never to return. In the March of 1943, 19-year-old Irma traveled to Poland to take up her new post in the women's section of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. There were more than 30,000 women imprisoned there, and Irma spent the next 2 years oppressing, terrifying, torturing and murdering untold thousands of them. Within 7 months, she was promoted to senior matron, a position in which she began regularly selecting victims for the gas chambers, often in partnership with chief matron Maria Mandel or with Dr. Josef Mengele, whose grisly medical atrocities had earned him the reputation among camp inmates as the White Angel of Death. Irma herself earned the nickname the Hyena of Auschwitz during her tenure at the infamous camp. The roll calls, parades and inspections Irma Grese carried out provided opportunities for making sport, one example of the grim and hideous vocabulary that evolved among Nazi camp guards. Making sport referred to the regular practice of targeting and punishing prisoners for any real or imagined infraction, sometimes fatally, with the level of severity often depending upon the disposition and mood of the guard. Numerous camp survivors testified that Grese was particularly vicious at Sportmachen, furiously whipping, caning or kicking with her jackboots those attempting to avoid her, or to shield others such as children from her during roll call or parade. The enforced exposure of prisoners to filthy and inhumane living conditions contrasted sharply with the impossible expectations the guards imposed on prisoners to keep their barracks clean and neat. Setting such impossible tasks was part of the systematic regime of abuse and demoralization. Surviving prisoners of Bergen-Belsen recalled Irma Grese squealing in exaggerated horror over the smallest spot or smudge during inspections of prisoner barracks, and the humiliating punishment or denial of food rations that might follow. While many guards were known to treat prisoners in such ways in the presence of other guards or prisoner functionaries, there were few who did so more arbitrarily or with less obvious pleasure than Irma Grese. On account of her particular viciousness, historians have often compared her to Amon Goeth, the infamous and murderous commandant of the Płaszów labor camp in Poland. A former inmate of Auschwitz testified that she had once seen Irma riding by one of the barracks on a bicycle and yelling at a Hungarian woman who happened to be standing out front to get back inside. Reportedly, without waiting to see whether or not her order would be obeyed, Grese drew her pistol and shot the woman dead before riding away as if nothing at all had happened. She could also be highly manipulative, purposely luring prisoners into situations for which she could justify inflicting punishment. One female inmate testified that Grese had once purposely started a rumor that potato peels were regularly dumped outside the door of the camp kitchen. When the inmate and her sister, both of them starving, finally mustered the courage to look for the food scraps under the cover of darkness, Irma was lying in wait for them not far from where she had carefully planted the potato peels. The inmate testified that Irma sprang at them out of the darkness and knocked the two sisters' heads together so hard and so violently that the inmate said she felt dizzy and nauseated for days afterwards. It should come as no surprise that by age 20, Grese had attained the second highest rank any SS woman could achieve, and for her noted and well-established reputation for the degradation and murder of countless so-called Untermenschen or subhumans, she was awarded a medal for meritorious war service to the Reich. Historians, psychologists, and behavioral scientists have for years wondered to what extent the camp system itself could be blamed for Irma Grese's unspeakable crimes. There is no doubt that the Nazis sought to mold the SS guards into murderers, especially after 1942. But the question remains, just how much malice was innate in Irma Grese to begin with, and how much was molded by her indoctrination and training? Considering the particular savagery and horrifying frequency of her crimes against camp inmates, and the obvious lack of any compassion or guilt for these actions, it is understandable that most Holocaust survivors who remembered Grese or experienced her cruelty cared very little, if at all, about why she did what she did. Almost all refused to view her as a victim, despite her age and vulnerability to easy indoctrination. The vast majority of guards, they insisted, were cruel and abusive, but not nearly as brutal or sadistic as Irma Grese proved to be. Although the exact number of her victims will probably never be known, some have estimated that the number may be as much or more than 18,000. Some historians have speculated that Grese may be among the most prolific female murderers of the entire 20th century. All this being said, some scholars still consider the question of how she became the sadistic individual that she did to be important, not to vindicate or excuse Grese's crimes, which of course nothing ever could, but to comprehend. Some continue to insist that it is important to understand how an environment that molds people into mass killers might be cultivated, if only to prevent such systems from ever again being created. According to one chain of analysis, the nourishing of violent tendencies was partly made possible by a carefully cultivated SS culture of rough camaraderie which punished so-called weakness, rewarded aggression, and incentivized internal corruption, exploitation, and theft. Guards in training were conditioned to view quote-unquote weakness in any one guard as a weakness for all, and trainees were roughly exhorted by senior guards to abuse prisoners, as well as praised for it. It is worth noting that some guards could be brutally punished themselves for taking it too easy on prisoners. Irma herself was ordered by Auschwitz's commandant, Rudolf Höss, to deliver the last 2 of 25 strikes with a cudgel to the head of a fellow matron who had been judged to be too lenient with inmates. Despite the seemingly ironclad rules governing all aspects of life in Nazi concentration camps, in reality, rules were broken all the time. In fact, the systemic program that the camps sought to produce could not function without the encouragement of all kinds of behavior on the part of the guards that would be unthinkable and horrifying in virtually any other professional or official environment. Although there were strict prohibitions against interaction of any kind with inmates, many guards did establish relationships with inmates, most of them exploitative. It is worth noting that the concentration camps could not run without prisoner functionaries, whose supervisory or administrative work meant that camps could function with fewer SS personnel. These individuals were assigned to supervise barracks, work details and punishments, and sometimes reported on their fellow prisoners to ensure their own safety and preferment. Despite the strict rules to the contrary, many prisoners ended up in exploitative personal and working relationships with the SS. Magda Hellinger was one example of a prisoner functionary who managed to use her position and influence with the guards and administrators to quietly save thousands of her fellow women prisoners from the gas chambers. Hellinger wrote that having to work with Irma Grese in Auschwitz's Camp C was deeply disturbing, not least because of her conduct towards prisoners, but also because Magda was forced to glimpse Grese's humanity. Irma, Magda recalled, often seemed to forget that she was a Jewish prisoner, talking to Hellinger as if trying to impress an older sister. Irma had no friends among the other female guards, and while Magda could not deny that Irma was undoubtedly evil and sadistic, she also came across as highly impressionable and vulnerable. Irma told Magda about her family and the terrible break she had experienced with them, especially her father, who, she claimed, had not wanted her to join the League of German Girls and disapproved of her career in the SS. She told Magda of her disappointment at failing her nursing apprenticeship and expressed her admiration for Dr. Karl Gebhardt's tutelage, calling him, of all things, a saint. Magda Hellinger is one of the few, or perhaps the only prisoner of the camps, who stood up to Irma Grese and lived. Magda recalled that 4 women had been brought to her at roll call one morning with hideous wounds from Irma's whip. Magda sent them to the infirmary to be treated by a prisoner physician and then privately confronted Irma. "What did you do to those poor women?" she demanded. "They are in great pain. Their wounds will likely become infected and they will die. Shame on you." Irma then raised her whip as if to strike Magda also. "Go on. I dare you to strike me too. I know you like to see blood," she told Grese defiantly. Irma then lowered the whip and Magda walked away. She was flabbergasted when Irma came to her later and asked her forgiveness. Another prisoner who worked closely with Irma Grese was Lilika Salzer, a survivor of Auschwitz and a seamstress. She provided her services to Irma in return for regular visits with her younger twin sisters, who were being kept in another part of the camp. In exchange for these visits, Lilika regularly tailored Irma's uniform and any other clothing Irma brought to her. SS officers placed a marked emphasis on presenting a neat, clean and well-tailored appearance. Since guards were issued only one uniform, a practice known as organizing was necessary for a guard to present the kind of appearance their superiors expected and approved of. Organizing was another example of a grim camp guard euphemism referring to the practice of requisitioning resources from prisoners, prisoner functionaries, or any easily bullied fellow guards for one's own benefit. The brutal conditions of the camps encouraged and rewarded the most aggressive and victimizing behavior, ensuring the survival and prosperity of the most vicious. According to numerous survivors, Irma Grese appeared to strut about the camp in her perfectly tailored and spotless uniform, her whip and silver-plated pistol prominently displayed at her hip, with her blonde hair artfully styled and her makeup flawless. Besides her sadistic cruelty, Irma's appearance was one of the things that prisoners remembered most about her, and it was also one of the things that most captured the attention of journalists and photographers who attended the Bergen-Belsen war crimes trial. Dr. Gisela Perl, who survived Auschwitz as one of the few doctors imprisoned at the camp, said of Irma, "She was one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Her body was perfect in every line, her face clear and angelic, and her blue eyes the gayest, the most innocent eyes one can imagine. And yet Irma Grese was the most depraved, cruel and imaginative pervert I ever came across." Another deeply disturbing aspect of camp guard culture was its debauchery. While not explicitly stated, there was a permissiveness and even tacit encouragement of sexual relationships between guards. Concentration camp survivors recalled that for many guards, there seemed to be a clear connection between the violence or death they inflicted and their frequent sexual escapades, which seemed to provide some sort of outlet. Guards would engage in the most horrific treatment of prisoners day in and day out, and then retire to staff parties and banquets, which invariably turned into alcohol-soaked affairs, after which not everyone would recall whom they'd gone to bed with. Irma Grese is believed to have had affairs with Auschwitz's commandant, Rudolf Höss, as well as with Dr. Josef Mengele, although Grese's relationship with Mengele reportedly ended abruptly when he discovered that she conducted sexual relationships with women as well as men. In terms of Irma Grese's conduct as a concentration camp guard, the connection between sex and death was particularly pronounced. Multiple Holocaust survivors testified that they witnessed Grese sexually assault and torture numerous women under her charge. Dr. Gisela Perl recalled that Grese even became visibly aroused watching her tend to those poor women's wounds while they screamed in pain. Several former inmates of Auschwitz remembered that Grese discreetly had sexual relationships with numerous female prisoners. This was a serious violation of the Race and Resettlement Act, and probably the only crime other than refusing to mistreat prisoners which might have carried any real punishment for a guard. In order to protect herself from discovery, Irma Grese sent the women to the gas chambers. Sometime between the late fall of 1943 and the early spring of 1944, believing that she might be pregnant, Irma quietly sought a medical examination from Dr. Gisela Perl. As it turned out, the easy sexuality of guard culture had caught up with her, and Dr. Perl informed her that she was indeed pregnant. Irma instructed the doctor to return to the clinic the following day and prepare for surgery. She promised to get Dr. Perl a coat in exchange for ending her pregnancy, a procedure which Irma could not access through the SS clinic since both contraception and termination of pregnancy were both illegal for Aryan women in Nazi Germany. The next day, when Dr. Perl had completed the procedure and Irma was dressed and preparing to depart, she said, "What a pity that you are a good doctor. What a pity that you have to die. Germany needs good doctors." Irma then threatened Dr. Perl, promising she would kill her if she told anyone about the operation. Irma never delivered the coat she had promised. Perhaps as alarming to Irma as her pregnancy was the suspicion that she might have contracted syphilis, which was rife among the guards at Auschwitz by 1944. The records of the SS medical clinic at the camp show that Irma was tested for syphilis in late January of 1944, and her diagnosis came back negative. Witness accounts and documentary evidence give contradictory details about Irma Grese's movements and whereabouts between January and April of 1945. At her trial, she claimed that she was transferred from Auschwitz back to Ravensbrück in January, before being sent to Bergen-Belsen camp in March, but no records remain of her initial transfer. Accounts from the Grese family's old neighbors in Vrecken stated that Irma had accompanied thousands of Ravensbrück prisoners on a forced march west in April 1945. As the Russian Allied forces advanced into Poland and began to encroach from the east, Nazi concentration camps began to evacuate as many prisoners and staff as possible to camps further west. According to Vrecken residents, Irma encountered her family quite by chance during this march, who were also fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Irma's father, stepmother, and siblings, perhaps certain that she would be arrested when the Allies overran Germany, reportedly urged Irma to come with them, which she allegedly refused to do, insisting that she would remain loyal to the Nazi cause and her duty. The veracity of this story cannot be ascertained for certain, since it does not appear in any testimony from the Grese family. Additionally, it conflicts with reports from the British Second Army, who arrested Irma Grese at the Belsen camp in mid-April 1945. Despite the fact that she was dubbed the beautiful beast by reporters and journalists who observed and wrote about her trial, Irma actually spent less than a month at the prison before the arrival of the British Army and Camp Commandant Josef Kramer's surrender. She did not seem to alter her behavior much, however, continuing to exhibit the same kinds of vicious behavior she had shown towards inmates at Auschwitz. While quite a few Nazi prison guards quietly fled their posts prior to the arrival of the Allied armies, many others stayed in the camps, perhaps as convinced as some military officials that there was still hope for a grand German counterattack that might stem the inevitable Allied victory. Irma later testified that she requested to be posted at Belsen because a certain Franz Hatzinger, an older married man with whom she had formed a relationship at Auschwitz, was stationed there. Kramer, Grese, and others who remained at Belsen appeared defiant to the occupying British authorities, perhaps certain that they would suffer no repercussions for simply having followed orders. Josef Kramer even affected a courteous magnanimity towards his British conquerors, standing with several other administrators in neat formation at the camp's entrance and cheerfully welcoming the army to the camp as the army rolled in. The British troops were utterly sickened and horrified at what they found at Bergen-Belsen. Approximately 100,000 prisoners had been crammed into a camp originally built for 8,000. Barracks built for 100 housed 1,000 prisoners. Belsen had no gas chambers, but thousands nonetheless died every week from enforced starvation, widespread typhus, or wanton murder by the guards. Even after the British troops arrived, they were shocked to hear continuous gunfire throughout the camp and realized that the SS was still trying to carry out their orders to kill as many of the camp's population as possible. The thousands upon thousands of bodies in various stages of decomposition were stacked in massive sickening piles throughout the camp, like cardboard, one British soldier remembered. After the arrest of the camp administration and SS personnel, Irma Grese was imprisoned at Celle, pending trial, which took place in the nearby city of Lüneburg. Grese and 44 of her fellow SS defendants were tried according to English law. 5 military officers and 1 civilian judge formed a tribunal to hear and judge each defendant, and attorneys were appointed from among the British and Polish Allied forces to defend them. Irma Grese proved singularly unhelpful to her lawyer or to her SS co-defendants with her behavior in court. Rather than appearing contrite or ashamed of the horrifying testimony made against her and other SS officers, she instead maintained a haughty and derisive attitude toward her accusers and the court's officers. She often laughed out loud during the testimony of former prisoners or simply looked disdainful and unrepentant. When the utterly hideous footage of the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen camps were shown in court, she affected the posture of someone supremely bored, turning away periodically to blow her nose or fix her hair. There was little that her lawyer, Major L.S.W. Cranfield, could do to forestall the inevitable verdict, besides insist that his client had only followed the orders of her superiors, a defense which Irma herself seemed to believe was quite sufficient. The sheer volume of testimony against her, however, was unbelievably damning, with far too many interviews with similar details and claims between them. Irma Grese's mark of disdain crumbled only once, when Helena Grese came to court to testify in her sister's defense as a character witness. Her testimony changed little. Helena's insistence that she could never imagine Irma beating or otherwise mistreating prisoners because she had always run from conflict as a child made no difference. The prosecutor easily weaponized this claim against Grese, conjecturing that this petty coward had perhaps never stood up to anybody with strength or confidence, but had found it easy to vent her rage upon helpless victims as soon as she was given the power and the permission to do so. When Helena described for the court the domestic incident that had led to Irma being exiled from her home and family, Irma's defiant facade finally cracked. She broke into tears and sobbed openly before the court. Because of the enormous volume of testimony and evidence to be presented, the Belsen trial did not begin until the 17th of September 1945. The proceedings took 2 months. On the 17th of November, the defendants were called before the court for sentencing. Irma Grese was found guilty of war crimes for the ill treatment and murder of prisoners at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Besides Johanna Bormann and Elisabeth Volkenrath, she was the only other woman out of the 19 Nazi matrons tried at Belsen to be sentenced to death. Major Cranfield paid a visit to his young client in her cell following her sentencing. Her composure had completely collapsed, he remembered. Her face was tear-streaked, her hair an unaccustomed mess, as if she had run her fingers through it again and again. He quietly informed her that she would be transferred to Hamelin prison to await her execution. Over the next few weeks, Irma wrote several letters to members of her family to say her goodbyes. She sent her love and urged them to remember her as they had last seen her. She exhorted them to hold their heads up and be proud Germans, even in the worst of trouble. "I am loyal to my fatherland to the death," she wrote. On the night before their execution, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann and Irma Grese stayed up late, the 3 of them defiantly singing Nazi songs together in their respective cells until well into the night. The next morning, Volkenrath was the first Belsen defendant to be executed just after 9:30 a.m. At 10 a.m., Irma was brought into the prison courtyard where Britain's official executioner, Albert Pierpoint, stood waiting at the scaffold. With no hesitation, she briskly climbed the steps, and without requiring any prodding, she promptly positioned herself upon the trapdoor, marked in the center with an X. The executioner quietly murmured his requisite, "Forgive me," as he placed a white hood over Irma's face and the carefully knotted noose around her neck. "Schnell," Irma whispered to him. "Quickly." It was the last word she spoke. The trap opened, her body dropped into it, there was a muted crack. A few minutes later, the body of Irma Grese was removed for the execution of Johanna Bormann and the 10 men who followed the 3 women to the grave. All were buried just outside the prison grounds. At 22 years old, Irma Grese remains the youngest woman ever to be formally executed by British authorities. More than one historian has since remarked on a few odd coincidences involving the Belsen executions. On Friday the 13th of December 1945, 13 criminals were hanged before a crowd of 13 spectators. Most academic study, discussion and writing on the Holocaust has focused on the leaders, the so-called desk murderers who consigned millions to their deaths with a stroke of a pen. Far less attention was paid to those who did most of the actual killing until the last 3 or 4 decades. During the period in between, Irma Grese and other brutal SS women like her were largely forgotten, except for those few truly avid World War II history buffs. Irma Grese's passage into the dark, seedy underbelly of popular history is deeply unsettling. First, the image that was cultivated of her in the media during the Belsen trial as the beautiful beast had the effect of highlighting her appearance and femininity alongside her crimes. No other Belsen defendant was photographed more frequently or had more print dedicated to her than Irma Grese. Her youth and beauty combined with her singularly vicious behavior encouraged what many would characterize as an unhealthy fetishization of her. Another factor which makes Irma Grese problematic as a historical figure lies in the fact that the brutality and murder she committed contrasts sharply with the stereotypical notions of femininity, which often characterizes women as inherently less aggressive than men. 20th and 21st century scholars, beginning with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, have asserted that the gendered characteristics unrelated to physiology are entirely socially constructed and are a function of where, when, and under what conditions people live and learn. Historians point out that the genocide in Nazi Germany was a function of the aggressive and nationalist culture of hyper-militarized hegemonic masculinity, one which would seem to automatically exclude women as oppressors. Yet women like Maria Mandl, Ilse Koch, Dorothea Binz, and of course Irma Grese committed atrocities every bit as terrible, and in many cases more so, than their male counterparts. Anyone who subscribed to traditional feminine ideals would be inspired to view them as deviants and aberrations. It is true, women were rare in the SS, and guards as sadistic as Irma Grese were even more rare. But considering how few German women served in such roles during the war, how can we ever hope to have any basis for comparison? Nearly 4,000 women served as SS matrons in the concentration camps, compared to roughly 24,000 men. But those women underwent the same training, navigated the same environments, and in a matter of weeks became accustomed to committing acts of violence of which traditionalists could not believe women were capable. Historians like Christopher Browning and Hannah Arendt posited that one of the darkest truths about World War II was that the Nazis who carried out those terrible crimes were, quote, ordinary men to begin with. However, a similar perspective on Nazi women has not yet fully evolved. The danger in this lies in how we have viewed and prosecuted genocide in the years since World War II, and how we will continue to do so in the future. A tiny minority of Nazi women were called to account for their crimes compared to Nazi men, and virtually no women from the Japanese military faced a tribunal at the end of World War II. In the more recent genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, women as well as men were involved in the programs of hyper-nationalism and mass murder. But yet again, only a tiny handful were considered for indictment by the International Criminal Court, and even fewer were prosecuted and convicted. Part of the issue also stems from the fact that women make up less than 5% of the world's militaries, and still represent a group most frequently targeted in war crimes, especially sexual crimes, rather than perpetrating them. And yet a British soldier who liberated Belsen recalled that partly in retribution for their crimes, the British had forced the SS guards to bury the body of every prisoner who had died in the camp. While many of the male guards were visibly sickened by the task, literally tried to run away from it, or even took their own lives rather than lay hands on those they had murdered, not one of the SS women shirked the task or showed revulsion while handling, one after another, the mountain of decomposing bodies left behind at Belsen. The life of Irma Grese was so dark that some might be led to question whether anything useful can be gained at all from studying it. Are her life and crimes still a valuable cautionary tale we need to preserve? Some might say that the recounting of her crimes serves more to titillate or awaken a gross fascination with violence, which can only be destructive. Would we do ourselves a favor or a disservice by consigning her to the dust heap of history? What do you think of Irma Grese? Have historians, psychologists, and behavioral scientists managed to sufficiently contextualize and comprehend Grese's viciousness and cruelty, the environment in which it flourished, or indeed Grese herself, or is there still more to understand? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.